Hey folks, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you grateful you're not royalty. The most embarrassing, cringeworthy, and absolutely mortifying dream confessions ever recorded by kings, queens, and emperors throughout history. And when I say embarrassing, I'm not talking about those dreams where you forget to wear pants to a meeting. These are full-scale royal humiliation scenarios that were so awkward, some monarchs literally changed laws to avoid dealing with the psychological aftermath. Picture this. You're the most powerful person in the known world, commanding armies, controlling vast treasures, literally holding the power of life and death over millions of people. And then you have a dream where you're caught naked at your own coronation, while your mother scolds you for not eating your vegetables. That's the kind of psychological warfare we're dealing with tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're listening to royal embarrassment stories at 2 a.m. like a proper insomniac, or if you're one of those rebels who falls asleep to monarchy mishaps during your lunch break. And don't worry if you drift off halfway through. That's kind of the point. Though, honestly, some of these stories are so secondhand embarrassing that you might stay awake just to see how much worse they get. Because here's the thing about dreams, they're the great equalizer. Doesn't matter if you're a peasant or a pharaoh, when you're unconscious, your brain has absolutely no respect for your dignity. Let's explore why even the most powerful people in history were sometimes completely powerless against the whims of sleep. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you, exposing every insecurity, fear, and embarrassing thought you've been trying to hide from your subjects. And when you're royalty, those embarrassing thoughts can involve some truly spectacular psychological disasters. Let's start with what might be the most vanity-crushing dream in royal history, the night King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had a recurring nightmare about losing his famous wig in front of his entire court. And when I say this dream devastated him, I mean it literally changed French court etiquette for the next century and turned the most powerful man in Europe into a paranoid, wig-obsessed mess who couldn't function without constant reassurance about his hair situation. Picture this. It's 1682 at the Palace of Versailles, and Louis XIV is at the absolute peak of his power. This is a man who's turned personal grooming into a public spectacle, where even watching him get dressed in the morning is considered a prestigious honor that nobles literally fight duels over. His elaborate wigs are legendary throughout Europe. Some of them cost more than most people's annual income and require teams of specialists working around the clock to maintain their magnificence. We're talking about wigs that were architectural marvels in their own right. These weren't just hair pieces. They were towering sculptures of human and horsehair, decorated with ribbons, jewels, and sometimes even tiny mechanical birds that would move when Louis turned his head. The royal wig collection employed over 40 craftsmen, including specialized curl setters, powder appliers, and what were essentially wig engineers who designed new structural support systems to handle increasingly elaborate designs. Louis had turned wig wearing into an art form that communicated everything about French superiority, royal magnificence, and divine authority. Foreign ambassadors would spend weeks studying the nuances of his wig choices, trying to decode political messages embedded in the curl patterns and decorative elements. The wig wasn't just fashion, it was foreign policy, domestic propaganda, and personal identity all rolled into one massive hairpiece. But starting in March 1682, Louis began having the same humiliating nightmare every single night for 3 weeks straight. In his dream, he's holding court in the famous Hall of Mirrors, surrounded by hundreds of the most important nobles in France, conducting some crucial state business, maybe receiving foreign ambassadors or announcing important policy decisions, when suddenly his magnificent wig just falls off. And we're not talking about a graceful slip or a dramatic flourish that could be played off as intentional. This was the most undignified wig failure imaginable. The thing would just plop onto the floor like a dead animal, bouncing slightly before settling into a pathetic heap of fake hair and expensive decorations. The sound it made in his dream was apparently particularly mortifying, a soft thud, followed by the tinkling of displaced jewelry. and the whisper of settling powder. Now, you have to understand that in 17th century France, a man's wig wasn't just a fashion statement. It was literally a symbol of power, virility, and divine authority. Louis XIV had been balding since his 20s, a fact that was one of the most closely guarded state secrets in Europe. His elaborate wigs were crucial to maintaining the illusion that he was this golden, godlike figure chosen by heaven to rule France and, by extension, most of the civilized world. The French court had developed an entire mythology around Louis' supposed natural beauty and divine perfection. Official portraits never showed him without his magnificent hair. Court poets wrote sonnets about his golden locks, and foreign diplomats were required to comment on his natural majesty and physical splendor. The idea that this divine beauty was actually fake hair glued to a balding middle-aged man was so threatening to French royal ideology that it bordered on treason. But in his nightmare, not only does the wig fall off, but everything gets infinitely worse from there. The courtiers don't politely pretend not to notice. They start pointing and laughing with genuine amusement rather than the carefully controlled reverence that normally surrounded every aspect of Louis's public appearances. His mistresses cover their faces in horror, not out of protective loyalty, but because his bald head is apparently so shocking that they can't bear to look at him. Foreign ambassadors in the dream start whispering and taking detailed notes, clearly planning to report back to their respective courts about the French king's embarrassing hair situation. Louis can see them sketching pictures of his bald head, writing diplomatic dispatches about French weakness and deception, and basically turning his personal humiliation into international political intelligence. But the worst part of the nightmare, the detail that would wake Louis up in a cold sweat, frantically checking his head, was when his own mother, Anne of Austria, would appear in the dream to lecture him about vanity and pride while he stood there bald and humiliated in front of everyone. She would deliver these long speeches about how pride goes before a fall, how earthly beauty is temporary, and how a true king's authority should come from his character rather than his appearance. Anne of Austria had been dead for several years by the time Louis was having these dreams, which made her ghostly appearance even more psychologically disturbing. In the nightmare, she would speak with the voice of divine judgment, essentially telling Louis that God was punishing his vanity by exposing his baldness to the world. The combination of personal humiliation and spiritual condemnation was apparently more than Louis' psyche could handle. The dream was so realistic that Louis would wake up frantically checking his head to make sure his nighttime wig was still in place. Yes, he wore wigs to bed, specially designed sleeping wigs that were lighter and more comfortable than his daytime models, but still provided coverage for his bald scalp. The idea of being seen with his natural head, even by his most intimate servants, was apparently intolerable. Louis became so paranoid about wig security that he started having his wig makers develop new attachment systems, involving tiny hooks sewn directly into his remaining hair. We're talking about what were essentially medieval hair plugs, painful, expensive, and probably medically dangerous procedures that anchored his wigs to his scalp through a combination of surgical techniques and pure determination to never experience his nightmare in real life. He also began sleeping with his nightcaps tied on so tightly that his personal physicians worried he might be cutting off circulation to his brain. Louis would rather risk brain damage than risk being seen with his natural baldness, which gives you some idea of how psychologically traumatic these wig dreams were for him. But here's where this gets really weird. Louis became so obsessed with preventing his nightmare from coming true that he instituted what became known as the wig protocol throughout the French court. This wasn't just personal paranoia, this became official state policy that affected hundreds of people and influenced European fashion for decades. The wig protocol included regulations about who was allowed to look directly at the king's head, above eyebrow level during different types of court functions. Servants were trained to avert their eyes when adjusting his clothing or accessories. Even his most intimate advisors were required to focus on his chin or chest during private meetings, never making direct eye contact that might draw attention to his forehead or hairline. Guards were stationed around the throne room with the specific job of catching the royal wig if it ever started to slip. These weren't just ceremonial guards, they were athletic young men who had been trained in wig-catching techniques and were positioned at strategic angles to intercept any falling hair pieces before they could hit the ground, and create the exact scenario from Louis's nightmare. Most bizarrely, Louis ordered that all mirrors in the palace be positioned so that he could monitor his wig's security at all times. Versailles was already famous for its mirrors, but after Louis's wig dreams, the entire palace was re-engineered to provide constant surveillance of royal hair status. Servants carried portable mirrors during court functions, and there were even mirrors installed in the ceiling so Louis could check his wig from above. The psychological impact of this dream on Louis was profound and honestly kind of pathetic when you consider that this was supposedly the most powerful man in Europe. Here's a guy who conquered most of Europe, built the most magnificent palace in the world, convinced an entire nation that he was basically a god walking among mortals, and successfully maintained absolute monarchy for over 70 years. The 3 weeks of wig-loss nightmares turned him into a paranoid, insecure mess who couldn't make it through a basic court function without constantly checking his reflection. Louis even consulted with court physicians about his dreams, and they came up with increasingly ridiculous explanations and treatments. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, the royal physician, suggested that the king's wig dreams were caused by excessive royal humors that could be balanced through regular bloodletting and purging. The idea was that Louis's body was producing too much vanity-related bile, which was disturbing his sleep and creating anxiety about his appearance. Another doctor, Claude Perrault, proposed that the nightmares were divine warnings about the dangers of pride and recommended that Louis should confess his wig-related sins to his priest and perform acts of humility to restore spiritual balance. Perrault actually suggested that Louis should appear in public without his wig once a month as a form of penance, which was such a horrifying suggestion that Louis had him reassigned to veterinary duties. The really embarrassing part is that Louis started sharing these dreams with his mistresses, apparently hoping they would reassure him about his attractiveness and convince him that his fears were unfounded. Madame de Maintenon, who would eventually become his secret wife, later wrote in her private letters that the king would wake up from his wig nightmares and spend hours asking her whether she would still love him if he were bald. Maintenon described these conversations as pathetic beyond description, and noted that the most powerful man in France was reduced to a whimpering child whenever he thought about losing his fake hair. She wrote that Louis would sometimes spend entire nights seeking reassurance about his physical appearance, asking the same questions repeatedly and requiring constant validation about his masculine attractiveness. But the situation got even more cringeworthy when Louis started having wig rehearsals, elaborate practice sessions, where his servants would simulate various wig emergency scenarios. They would create artificial wind conditions to test wig stability, practice rapid wig replacement procedures, and even stage mock assassination attempts, where enemies might try to dislodge the royal hairpiece as a form of political attack. These rehearsals were conducted with the same seriousness as military drills, with servants playing different roles and Louis practicing his responses to various wig-threatening situations. There were protocols for maintaining dignity during wig slippage, techniques for repositioning displaced hairpieces without drawing attention, and even backup wigs strategically positioned around the palace in case of wig emergencies. The courtiers thought the king had completely lost his mind. Here they were, trying to discuss important matters of state, military campaigns, international diplomacy, and economic policy, while Louis was obsessing over hypothetical wig disasters and demanding detailed analysis of hair-related security threats. Some nobles started placing bets on how long the king's wig paranoia would last, and whether he would eventually just shave his head and end the psychological torture. Foreign ambassadors began including observations about Louis's wig behavior in their diplomatic reports, noting that the French king seemed unusually preoccupied with his appearance and was displaying signs of what we might now recognize as obsessive-compulsive disorder. The English ambassador wrote that Louis inspects his reflection with the frequency of a woman and the anxiety of a condemned man, while the Spanish ambassador described him as a monarch enslaved by his own vanity. The nightmare cycle finally ended when Louis's chief wig maker, a clever craftsman named Pierre Rousseau, created what he called the dream-proof wig, a contraption that was basically welded to the king's skull through a system of hidden clips, pins, and what were probably the world's first hair transplants. Rousseau had studied the exact details of Louis's nightmare and designed a wig attachment system that would make the dream scenario physically impossible. The dream-proof wig was a technological marvel that involved surgical procedures, mechanical engineering, and what amounted to permanent installation of artificial hair directly into Louis's scalp. The wig was so securely attached that Louis could have done backflips, gotten into sword fights, or survived tornado-force winds without losing it. Rousseau guaranteed that the wig was literally unremovable except through deliberate surgical intervention. But this solution created new problems that were almost as bad as the original nightmares. The dream-proof wig was so uncomfortable that Louis could barely turn his head, so heavy that it gave him chronic neck problems, and so tightly attached that it caused constant headaches and probably restricted blood flow to his brain. Foreign ambassadors noted that the French king seemed to have developed a strange robotic way of moving his head, and some suspected he might be suffering from some kind of neurological condition. Louis wore this torture device for the rest of his reign, which lasted another 33 years. He never experienced wig loss dreams again, but he also never experienced normal head movement, comfortable sleep, or natural hair sensation for the remainder of his life. He had essentially traded psychological torture for physical torture, proving that sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. The psychological legacy of Louis XIV's wig nightmares lasted long after his death in 1715. French court etiquette continued to include elaborate wig protocols well into the 18th century, with nobles spending enormous amounts of time and money on hair-related fashion and security measures. The obsession with artificial hair became so embedded in French aristocratic culture that many historians argue it contributed to the social tensions that eventually led to the French Revolution. The common people of France were struggling with poverty, hunger, and economic hardship while their ruling class was spending fortunes on fake hair and developing neurotic obsessions about their appearance. When the revolutionaries eventually stormed Versailles, one of their first symbolic acts was destroying the royal wig collection and mocking the aristocratic obsession with artificial beauty. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Louis's wig dreams was how they demonstrated that even absolute monarchs could be completely controlled by their unconscious fears and insecurities. Here was a man who claimed to rule by divine right, who convinced millions of people that he was God's representative on earth, who built monuments to his own glory that lasted for centuries, and yet he was psychologically enslaved by anxiety about losing his fake hair. When your dreams about bad hair days become national policy and influence international relations for decades, you're probably taking vanity to unhealthy extremes. But Louis XIV's wig nightmares perfectly illustrate how even the most powerful people can be completely undone by their unconscious insecurities, and how personal psychological problems can have political and cultural consequences that extend far beyond the individual experiencing them. Modern psychologists who have studied Louis XIV's case recognize it as a textbook example of how anxiety disorders can affect people regardless of their social status or actual power. His wig dreams reveal a man who was deeply insecure about his physical appearance and desperately afraid of being exposed as less than the perfect divine figure he claimed to be. The tragedy of Louis XIV's wig obsession is that it prevented him from developing more authentic sources of self-worth and political authority. Instead of building his identity around his genuine accomplishments, intelligence, or leadership abilities, he became psychologically dependent on artificial external symbols that were inherently fragile and temporary. But there's also something almost touching about these dreams, because they show us that underneath all the pomp and ceremony, Louis XIV was just a balding, middle-aged man who was worried about what people would think of him if they saw him as he really was. His wig dreams were ultimately about the very human fear of being seen, judged, and found wanting feelings that connect him to people across all social classes and historical periods. When your dreams force you to confront the gap between your public image and your private reality, when your unconscious mind strips away all the artificial props that support your identity, when sleep becomes a nightly reminder of your fundamental human vulnerability, well, That's when you discover that power and privilege can't protect you from the basic psychological challenges that face everyone who has ever worried about being accepted, respected, and loved for who they really are. Now let's talk about Queen Elizabeth I's most mortifying recurring nightmare, dreams, where she would grow a full beard overnight and have to rule England while trying to hide her sudden facial hair from everyone at court. This sounds like it should be funny, but for Elizabeth, these dreams were psychological torture that revealed her deepest anxieties about gender, power, legitimacy, and the impossible balancing act of being a female ruler in a world that considered women fundamentally unfit to govern. You have to understand that Elizabeth I was walking the most precarious tightrope in European history as a female ruler in 16th century England. She'd spent her entire reign carefully crafting an image of the Virgin Queen, feminine enough to inspire romantic devotion and protective instincts, but strong enough to command respect in a world where women were considered intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, and spiritually weak compared to men. Every aspect of Elizabeth's appearance was crucial to this impossibly delicate balancing act. She spent enormous amounts of time and the royal treasury's money on cosmetics, wigs, elaborate dresses, and jewelry designed to project both power and femininity simultaneously. Her famous white face paint wasn't just vanity, it was political strategy, creating an otherworldly, almost divine appearance that transcended normal gender categories while still maintaining her essential femininity. Elizabeth's public image required her to be simultaneously virgin and mother, warrior and lady, intellectually brilliant and emotionally nurturing, politically ruthless and personally compassionate. She had to be strong enough to face down the Spanish Armada, but delicate enough to inspire courtly love poetry. She needed to be smart enough to outmaneuver the craftiest politicians in Europe, but feminine enough that her authority didn't threaten the fundamental gender assumptions of 16th century society. But starting around 1588, right after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, when Elizabeth should have been feeling most confident about her abilities and legitimacy, she began having these incredibly detailed nightmares about sprouting masculine facial hair. And we're not talking about the light facial hair that some older women develop naturally. These were dreams about growing full, thick, obviously masculine beards that would instantly destroy her carefully constructed gender identity. The dreams were always set during the most important court functions where Elizabeth needed to appear most regal and in controlled diplomatic receptions with foreign ambassadors, parliamentary sessions where she was defending controversial policies, religious ceremonies where she was asserting her authority as head of the Church of England, or military reviews where she needed to inspire confidence in her ability to lead England's defenses. In her nightmares, Elizabeth would be conducting these crucial state functions when she would suddenly become aware that she was growing a beard. Not gradually, not subtly, but rapidly and obviously, with thick dark hair sprouting from her chin and cheeks, while she was trying to maintain royal dignity and political authority in front of hundreds of people whose respect and loyalty were essential to her survival. Elizabeth described these dreams in her private papers, which weren't discovered until centuries later when historians gained access to previously sealed royal archives. The level of detail in her dream accounts is both fascinating and deeply sad, revealing a woman who was constantly terrified that her gender would undermine her political authority and that any sign of masculine characteristics would be used to attack her legitimacy. In her nightmare descriptions, Elizabeth would become aware of the facial hair growth during crucial moments, while delivering important speeches, while receiving foreign dignitaries, while presiding over court ceremonies where any sign of weakness or abnormality could be politically devastating. She would feel the hair growing but would be unable to stop or hide it, trapped in situations where she had to continue performing her royal duties while knowing that everyone was staring at her transforming face. The psychological torture of these dreams came from Elizabeth's desperate attempts to hide the facial hair while maintaining royal composure and continuing to fulfill her political responsibilities. She would try to position her hands strategically to cover her chin, turn her head at angles that might hide the beard, or use fans and handkerchiefs to obscure the lower part of her face without making her efforts obvious to the watching courtiers. But in her nightmares, these concealment efforts never worked effectively. The beard would be too prominent to hide, her attempts at concealment would be too obvious and would draw more attention to her face, and she would be caught in an impossible situation where trying to hide the facial hair was almost as embarrassing as having it visible. What made these dreams particularly tormenting for Elizabeth was that they played directly into real contemporary debates about female authority and the supposed unnaturalness of women wielding political power. Critics of her reign, both in England and throughout Europe, regularly used gender-based attacks against her, arguing that female rulers were contrary to divine law and that women who held power would inevitably develop masculine characteristics as a punishment for violating natural gender roles. Catholic propagandists, who opposed Elizabeth's Protestant reforms and her claim to legitimate rule, frequently circulated pamphlets and writings that described female political authority as a form of demonic possession that would physically transform women and make them into unnatural creatures. Elizabeth's beard dreams were essentially her unconscious mind torturing her, with the very accusations that her enemies used to undermine her authority. The religious dimensions of these nightmares were particularly disturbing for Elizabeth because they connected to serious theological debates about gender, authority, and divine will that affected her legitimacy as both queen and head of the Church of England. Protestant reformers had generally supported female rulers more than Catholics, but there were still significant theological questions about whether women could legitimately exercise religious authority. Elizabeth's role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England required her to be the ultimate religious authority in her realm, making religious decisions that affected the spiritual welfare of millions of people. The idea that divine displeasure with female religious leadership might manifest through physical masculine transformation was theologically plausible enough to be genuinely terrifying for someone in her position. The Queen became so disturbed by her recurring beard nightmares that she consulted with her personal physician, Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, about whether it was medically possible for stress, political pressure, or divine judgment to cause women to grow masculine facial hair rapidly. Dr. Lopez was a Portuguese converso physician who had fled the Inquisition and served Elizabeth loyally for many years, making him one of the few people she trusted with sensitive personal information. Dr. Lopez assured Elizabeth that while some older women did develop increased facial hair due to natural aging processes, it was extremely unlikely to happen overnight and certainly not to the extent she was dreaming about. He explained the medical understanding of the time about how age and constitutional changes could affect women's appearance, but he emphasized that rapid beard growth was not a documented medical phenomenon. But Elizabeth wasn't satisfied with purely medical reassurance about her beard anxiety. She wanted to understand whether there might be spiritual or supernatural explanations for her dreams, and whether they might represent divine warnings about the appropriateness of female rule. She consulted with various Protestant theologians and court chaplains about the religious significance of dreams involving gender transformation. The theological consultations produced conflicting and often contradictory interpretations of Elizabeth's beard dreams. Some Protestant theologians argued that the dreams were demonic attacks designed to undermine her confidence and spiritual authority, requiring prayer, fasting, and religious ritual to counteract satanic influence. Others suggested that the dreams might be divine tests of her humility and faith, requiring her to demonstrate her continued trust in God's support for her reign despite psychological challenges. A few particularly bold court chaplains even suggested that Elizabeth's beard dreams might be divine encouragement for her to consider marriage and traditional feminine roles, arguing that God was using the nightmares to remind her that political authority was naturally masculine and that she should seek a husband who could provide proper male leadership for England. These theological interpretations were obviously problematic for Elizabeth because they either suggested that she was under spiritual attack due to the unnaturalness of her position, or that God was actively encouraging her to abandon the independent female rule that had brought England unprecedented prosperity and international respect. Elizabeth began implementing various strategies to address her beard anxiety that went far beyond normal royal grooming practices. She started having her ladies-in-waiting check her face multiple times throughout the day, supposedly to ensure her makeup was perfect, but really to confirm that no surprise facial hair had appeared overnight or during the stress of royal duties. These facial inspection sessions became elaborate rituals that involved multiple ladies-in-waiting examining Elizabeth's face under different lighting conditions, using magnifying glasses and mirrors to detect any signs of unwanted hair growth. The Queen would require these inspections before every public appearance. After stressful political meetings, and sometimes multiple times during particularly challenging days, Elizabeth also began carrying small mirrors everywhere she went, obsessively checking her reflection whenever she thought no one was looking. Courtiers noted that the Queen had developed a habit of touching her face frequently during conversations, apparently checking for facial hair that wasn't actually there. These behaviors became so obvious that foreign ambassadors started commenting on Elizabeth's apparent preoccupation with her appearance. The psychological impact of these beard dreams on Elizabeth's behavior was significant and honestly heartbreaking. When you consider the enormous pressures she was already facing as a female ruler in a hostile political environment, she started avoiding certain lighting conditions that might reveal facial hair that didn't exist, positioning herself strategically during public appearances to ensure the most flattering angles, and spending increasing amounts of time on elaborate makeup application designed to emphasize her feminine features. Elizabeth's daily routine began to include extended periods dedicated to what her ladies-in-waiting called beauty confirmation, elaborate makeup and grooming sessions that were really anxiety, management rituals designed to reassure her that she still looked appropriately feminine for a female monarch. These sessions could last for hours and involved multiple servants, specialized cosmetics, and increasingly complex procedures designed to maximize her feminine appearance. But perhaps most tragically, Elizabeth began changing her daily schedule and political activities to minimize stress that might trigger facial hair growth. She started avoiding particularly contentious political debates, delegating more responsibilities to male advisors, and reducing her direct involvement in situations that might provoke the kind of pressure that she associated with her beard dreams. This reduction in Elizabeth's direct political engagement was subtle enough that most courtiers and foreign observers didn't recognize it as anxiety-driven behavior, but it represented a significant change in her leadership style that may have affected important policy decisions during crucial periods of her reign. Elizabeth's beard anxiety also began influencing her artistic and cultural patronage in ways that revealed her deep insecurity about gender and political legitimacy. She started commissioning portraits that emphasized her feminine features more dramatically than her earlier royal images, requiring artists to paint her with exaggerated feminine characteristics that would make any suggestion of masculine appearance seem ridiculous. The famous portraits from the later part of Elizabeth's reign show increasingly elaborate makeup, jewelry, and hair styling that seems designed to scream, "I am definitely a woman," to anyone who might be wondering about her gender identity or the appropriateness of female rule. These images were political propaganda designed to counteract the kind of gender-based criticism that appeared in her dreams. Elizabeth also began patronizing literature and theater that celebrated powerful women and challenged traditional gender assumptions about female capabilities. The flowering of English Renaissance drama during her reign included many plays, featuring strong female characters who successfully wielded political and social power while maintaining their essential femininity. The most embarrassing aspect of Elizabeth's beard situation was that she apparently shared her facial hair anxieties with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was probably the love of her life and certainly the closest she ever came to marriage. Dudley's private correspondence, discovered centuries later, reveals that Elizabeth would sometimes wake up from her beard nightmares and ask him to examine her face for signs of masculine hair growth. Dudley described these requests as pitiable and noted that the most powerful woman in England was reduced to seeking reassurance about her femininity from a man who couldn't even marry her due to the political complications that would arise from the Queen taking a husband. He wrote that Elizabeth's anxiety about her appearance was pathetic beyond description, and suggested that the pressures of female rule were taking a severe psychological toll. These intimate moments with Dudley reveal Elizabeth's profound loneliness and vulnerability beneath her carefully constructed public image of confident, independent female authority. Her beard dreams forced her to confront her deepest fears about gender, legitimacy, and acceptance in ways that she couldn't share with anyone except the man she loved but couldn't marry. But here's where Elizabeth's story gets really complex. Her beard dreams started influencing her policy decisions in ways that had lasting positive effects on English society. She became increasingly supportive of laws and customs that protected women's rights to control their own appearance, economic activities, and social relationships. Elizabeth's personal anxiety about feminine appearance contributed to England developing surprisingly progressive attitudes toward women's fashion, beauty practices, and economic independence during her reign. She understood from personal experience how much pressure women faced to maintain appropriate gender presentations, and she used her political authority to reduce some of those pressures for other women. The Queen also became notably hostile toward men who criticized women's appearance or suggested that female political participation was unnatural or inappropriate. Courtiers learned to avoid making gender-based jokes or comments about women's capabilities in Elizabeth's presence, because such remarks would provoke surprisingly sharp responses from a queen who was sensitive about gender-related criticism. Elizabeth's beard anxiety even influenced her international diplomatic strategy in subtle but important ways. She became particularly skilled at using foreign leaders' assumptions about female weakness and irrationality to her advantage, appearing to be more feminine and less threatening than she actually was in order to catch her enemies off guard with her political acumen and strategic intelligence. The irony of Elizabeth's beard nightmares is that they were completely unfounded. She maintained her feminine appearance throughout her entire 45-year reign and was never actually at risk of developing masculine facial hair. But the psychological torment these dreams caused reveals how much pressure she felt to prove her legitimacy as a female ruler in a society that fundamentally questioned women's fitness for political authority. Elizabeth's beard dreams finally stopped around 1595, coinciding with her final acceptance that she would never marry or have children and her full embrace of her identity as the permanent Virgin Queen. Some psychologists who have studied her case suggest that the nightmares represented her unconscious anxieties about choosing political power over traditional feminine roles, and that they ended when she made peace with being an unconventional woman who had sacrificed conventional feminine fulfillment for unprecedented female achievement. The lasting impact of Elizabeth's beard anxiety can be seen in how carefully she controlled her image for the rest of her reign and how her strategies for managing gender-based political pressure influenced subsequent female leaders. Every portrait, every public appearance, every ceremonial outfit was designed to emphasize her femininity while projecting strength and authority, a balancing act that female political leaders still struggle with today. Elizabeth's beard dreams also contributed to her developing what might be the first systematic approach to managing the psychological pressures of female political leadership. She created support systems, coping strategies, and image management techniques that helped her survive and thrive in a hostile political environment while maintaining her mental health and political effectiveness. When your dreams about facial hair become a matter of national security and international diplomacy, you're probably dealing with some serious psychological pressure that reflects broader social conflicts about gender, power, and legitimacy. Elizabeth I's beard nightmares show us that even the most successful female leaders can be haunted by insecurities that seem completely irrational but feel absolutely real to the person experiencing them. But perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth's story demonstrates how personal psychological struggles can sometimes lead to positive social changes when the person experiencing them has the power and opportunity to address the underlying social conditions that create those struggles. Her beard anxiety contributed to policies and cultural changes that made life easier for other women, turning her personal pain into broader social progress. Modern female political leaders who study Elizabeth I's reign often identify strongly with her gender-related anxieties and the impossible expectations she faced about balancing femininity with authority. Her beard dreams represent fears that persist across centuries, worries about being seen as too masculine, too aggressive, too unfeminine to be acceptable as a woman, but also fears about being seen as too weak, too emotional, too feminine to be effective as a leader. When your unconscious mind turns your deepest insecurities about gender and legitimacy into nightly torture sessions involving facial hair that represents everything you're afraid people will think about your right to hold power, you're dealing with psychological pressures that reveal the fundamental contradictions and impossible expectations that societies place on women who dare to claim authority in male-dominated institutions. King Charles II of England had what might be the most bizarre and embarrassing recurring dream in royal history, nightmares, where all the animals in his extensive menagerie would suddenly start talking. But instead of saying wise or magical things like in fairy tales, they would just complain constantly about his personal hygiene, mock his romantic life, and deliver devastating critiques of his political decisions. And the really humiliating part was that Charles kept detailed dream journals that survived. So we know exactly how much these talking animal dreams disturbed him and how they completely changed his relationship with his beloved pets. Now, you need to understand that Charles II was known as the Merry Monarch, a party-loving king who restored fun, science, and sexual freedom to England after the grim, joy-killing Puritan rule of Oliver Cromwell. Charles was famous throughout Europe for his love of natural philosophy, his collection of exotic animals, his numerous mistresses, his patronage of arts and sciences, and his generally hedonistic approach to royal life. This should have been a guy living his absolute best life. But these animal dreams apparently made him question everything about his lifestyle and personal choices. Charles's menagerie at Whitehall Palace was legendary even by royal standards. We're talking about one of the most extensive collections of exotic animals in 17th century Europe, everything from his beloved spaniels and exotic birds to monkeys, deer, pelicans, and even a few big cats that had been gifts from various foreign rulers. The Royal Zoo was both a scientific research facility and a diplomatic tool, showcasing England's wealth and international connections while providing Charles with genuine entertainment and intellectual stimulation. The king genuinely loved his animals and spent hours every day personally interacting with them, feeding them special treats, observing their behaviors, and even conducting primitive behavioral experiments as part of his interest in natural philosophy. Charles was actually quite progressive in his treatment of animals, providing them with elaborate housing, medical care, and enrichment activities that were far beyond the standards of the time. But starting in 1671, Charles began having these incredibly detailed nightmares where his pet spaniels, his absolute favorite animals that accompanied him everywhere and slept in his bedchamber, would suddenly start speaking in posh English, accents and delivering scathing critiques of his personal hygiene and lifestyle choices. In his dream journals, Charles described how his favorite spaniel, a dog named Rogue, would approach him during court functions and say things like, "Your Majesty, I must inform you that your personal aroma is quite offensive to those of us with sensitive canine noses. And frankly, it's rather embarrassing for those of us who must share your living quarters and represent your household to visiting dignitaries." Now, you have to understand that personal hygiene in the 17th century was different. Even kings didn't bathe regularly by modern standards, and Charles was actually considered quite clean for his era. But in his dreams, his dogs had apparently developed extremely high standards and weren't shy about expressing their disapproval. But the spaniel criticism went far beyond hygiene complaints. In Charles's nightmares, Rogue would deliver detailed analyses of his romantic relationships, his political decisions, and his general fitness to rule England. The dog would say things like, "Your Majesty's approach to foreign policy lacks the strategic coherence that one might expect from a monarch who claims divine appointment, and your romantic entanglements are frankly scandalous to those of us who maintain higher moral standards." The psychological impact of being lectured about morality by his own dog was apparently devastating for Charles, because these were criticisms that his human advisors would never dare voice directly. But that probably reflected his own unconscious anxieties about his lifestyle and leadership abilities. But it wasn't just the dogs. Charles dreamed that his collection of exotic birds, parrots, peacocks, and various rare species would form elaborate feathered choruses that would sing satirical songs about his romantic failures and political mistakes. The parrots would repeat embarrassing quotes from his former mistresses, mimicking their voices and intonations in ways that brought back all the awkward moments from his complicated love life. Charles's romantic life was notoriously complex even by royal standards. He had numerous official mistresses, countless casual relationships, and at least 14 acknowledged illegitimate children. His sexual appetite was famous throughout Europe, and while this enhanced his reputation in some circles, it also created political problems and personal complications that apparently haunted his unconscious mind. In his dreams, the parrots would perform elaborate musical numbers that recounted his most embarrassing romantic moments in excruciating detail. They would sing about times when he had been caught in compromising situations, occasions when his mistresses had publicly humiliated him, and instances when his sexual behavior had created diplomatic or political difficulties. The peacocks, according to Charles's dream journals, would stage elaborate fashion shows where they would mock his clothing choices, his dancing abilities, and his general physical appearance. They would strut around displaying their magnificent plumage, while making cutting comments about how Charles's natural appearance didn't live up to royal standards and how his attempts at courtly elegance were frankly ridiculous. But perhaps the most mortifying part of these animal dreams was that Charles's beloved pet monkeys would stage elaborate comedic performances that reenacted his most embarrassing moments in excruciating detail. These weren't just random silly monkey antics. These were sophisticated theatrical productions where the monkeys would assign roles, develop costumes from available materials, and perform satirical versions of important royal ceremonies and political events. The monkeys would pretend to be Charles trying to impress women at court, complete with exaggerated facial expressions, ridiculous romantic gestures, and mocking commentary about his seduction techniques. They would perform parodies of his speeches to Parliament, his diplomatic meetings with foreign ambassadors, and his attempts to appear wise and statesmanlike during important state functions. In one particularly detailed dream entry, Charles described watching his monkeys perform an elaborate reenactment of his attempt to court a French duchess, complete with one monkey wearing a makeshift crown and cape while delivering pompous romantic speeches that were apparently so accurate that Charles woke up feeling mortified about his actual romantic behavior. The monkeys would also stage satirical versions of important royal ceremonies, with one monkey playing Charles and others playing various courtiers, foreign dignitaries, and religious officials. These performances would highlight all the moments when Charles had appeared confused, unprepared, or generally inadequate to the ceremonial and political demands of kingship. Charles was so disturbed by these talking animal dreams that he started avoiding his own menagerie during his waking hours, which was particularly awkward because showing off his exotic animals was one of his favorite royal activities and a major attraction for foreign visitors to the English court. Diplomatic protocol often included tours of the royal zoo, where Charles would demonstrate his knowledge of natural philosophy and his commitment to scientific advancement. But after his animal dreams began, Charles would make excuses to avoid these zoo visits, delegating them to other courtiers or simply canceling them altogether. Foreign ambassadors who had specifically requested to see the famous English royal menagerie were confused and sometimes offended when their hosts seemed reluctant to showcase what had previously been one of the highlights of visiting the English court. The psychological impact of these dreams on Charles was both profound and kind of ridiculous when you consider that he was supposed to be one of the most powerful men in Europe. He became convinced that animals could somehow sense his personal shortcomings and were judging him even when they couldn't actually speak. This led to increasingly paranoid behavior around his pets and bizarre attempts to improve his standing in their eyes. Charles started bathing more frequently than was normal for the 17th century, apparently hoping to address the hygiene complaints that his dream dogs had raised. He consulted with various physicians and perfumers about improving his personal scent, experimenting with different soaps, oils, and fragrances that might make him more acceptable to what he imagined were his pet's refined sensibilities. He also began changing his cologne and personal grooming routine based on how he thought his animals might react. Charles would test different scents by observing his dog's reactions, interpreting their behavior as approval or disapproval of his grooming choices. His servants noted that the king had become unusually preoccupied with his appearance and was spending much more time on personal hygiene than had been his previous habit. But perhaps most embarrassingly, Charles began treating his animals differently based on his dream anxieties, engaging in behavior that his courtiers found increasingly bizarre and concerning. He would apologize to his dogs for any perceived hygiene issues, having long, one-sided conversations with them about his efforts to improve his personal care and lifestyle choices. Charles would spend extended periods talking to his parrots about his romantic life, apparently seeking their approval or forgiveness for his complicated relationships and sexual behavior. Servants reported overhearing the king having detailed discussions with birds about his various mistresses, asking for their opinions about his romantic choices and promising to behave more morally in the future. Most bizarrely, Charles started feeding his monkeys better food and providing them with enhanced entertainment and enrichment activities because he was worried they might be mocking him due to inadequate care rather than genuine disapproval of his personal character. He commissioned elaborate new housing for the monkeys, hired additional keepers to attend to their needs, and even arranged for musicians to perform for them regularly. Charles's dream journals reveal that he tried various strategies to stop the animal criticism nightmares, approaching them with the same scientific curiosity that he applied to his other natural philosophy interests. He experimented with sleeping in different rooms of the palace, hoping that physical distance from his animals might prevent them from appearing in his dreams or reduce their access to information about his personal life. He also changed his diet systematically, testing whether certain foods triggered the talking animal dreams or affected their content. Charles kept detailed records of what he ate on nights when he experienced animal dreams versus nights when he slept peacefully, looking for patterns that might explain the psychological phenomenon he was experiencing. Charles even consulted with court physicians about whether animals might have telepathic abilities that allowed them to communicate with humans during sleep, or whether there might be medical explanations for dreams that seemed to provide accurate information about his personal shortcomings. Dr. Thomas Willis, one of the leading physicians of the time, assured Charles that animals did not possess supernatural communication abilities, but also noted that the king's dreams might reflect genuine self-awareness about areas where he could improve his personal conduct. One particularly humiliating episode occurred when Charles shared his animal dreams with Barbara Villars, Countess of Castlemaine, one of his most prominent and influential mistresses. Barbara was known for her sharp wit, political intelligence, and ability to manipulate Charles through a combination of sexual attraction and intellectual stimulation. Barbara apparently found Charles's animal anxiety absolutely hilarious and began making jokes about whether the king preferred animal approval over human affection. She would tease him about his conversations with his pets, suggesting that he was more concerned about his dog's opinions than his subjects' welfare or his mistress's satisfaction. Their relationship deteriorated significantly after Charles confided his dream anxieties to Barbara, with her later writing to friends that the king was more concerned about his spaniel's approval than the governance of England, and that his obsession with animal opinions was pathetic beyond description. Her mockery of his animal dreams contributed to their eventual breakup and Charles's growing reluctance to share personal information with his romantic partners. The talking animal dreams also started affecting Charles's political decisions in ways that his advisors found increasingly concerning and unpredictable. He became reluctant to make important announcements in rooms where his pets were present, apparently worried that the animals might somehow sense if he was lying or making poor choices that would later appear in his dreams as animal criticism. Foreign ambassadors noted that the English king seemed unusually nervous around his own menagerie during diplomatic functions, often avoiding eye contact with his pets or positioning himself so that animals couldn't observe his interactions with visiting dignitaries. Some diplomats began to wonder whether Charles was developing mental health problems or superstitious beliefs that were affecting his political judgment. Charles's animal anxiety even influenced his approach to important state ceremonies and religious observances. He would arrange for his pets to be moved to different parts of the palace during particularly significant events, apparently hoping to prevent them from witnessing anything that might later provide material for dream criticism. But this strategy backfired spectacularly because Charles then started having dreams, where the displaced animals were complaining about their new accommodations and blaming him for their unhappiness. His dream journals describe elaborate guilt trips delivered by birds who were upset about being moved to less luxurious quarters and monkeys who felt they were being punished without understanding what they had done wrong. The most ridiculous aspect of this whole situation was that Charles started seeking advice about animal psychology from the early members of the Royal Society, England's premier scientific organization that he had helped establish. He commissioned studies on animal intelligence, funded research into whether creatures could communicate telepathically with humans, and even suggested that the Royal Society investigate the possibility of teaching animals to speak. Charles's interest in animal communication research was partly genuine scientific curiosity, but it was also motivated by his desire to understand whether his dream animals might be expressing real thoughts and feelings that his pets were unable to communicate during their waking hours. He wanted to know whether his dreams were providing accurate insights into his animals' actual opinions about his behavior and character. Robert Hooke, the famous scientist and Royal Society member, was commissioned to study Charles's animals and determine whether they showed signs of advanced intelligence or unusual communication abilities. Hooke's experiments included attempts to teach the royal parrots more sophisticated vocabulary and testing whether the monkeys could learn complex symbolic communication systems. These research projects yielded interesting scientific insights about animal cognition and behavior, but they didn't provide any evidence that Charles's pets were actually capable of the sophisticated moral and political commentary that appeared in his dreams. Hooke concluded that while the royal animals were indeed intelligent and responsive to human behavior, they were not capable of the complex judgments and criticisms that Charles was experiencing in his nightmares. The talking animal nightmares finally ended in 1678 when Charles experienced what he described as the most vivid and realistic dream of the entire series. In this final dream, all his animals gathered together in an elaborate council meeting, where they delivered a collective speech explaining that they were tired of appearing in his dreams and wanted to return to being normal, non-speaking pets. According to Charles's dream journal, the animals explained that his anxiety about their opinions was preventing him from enjoying their company and was making their own lives more stressful because he had become so nervous and self-conscious around them. They asked him to stop worrying about their approval and just return to the natural, relaxed relationship they had enjoyed before his dreams began. The dream animals also assured Charles that while they had noticed some of his personal shortcomings, they loved him regardless, and were more interested in receiving good care and attention than in judging his moral character or political decisions. They explained that his efforts to improve his behavior had been appreciated but were unnecessary for maintaining their affection and loyalty. This final dream felt so real and convincing to Charles that he woke up completely convinced that his animals had actually spoken to him, had collectively decided to end his psychological torture. He spent the rest of the day thanking them for agreeing to stop appearing in his dreams and promising to return to treating them as beloved pets rather than potential critics. The lasting impact of Charles II's animal dreams was actually quite positive for both the king and his pets, despite the embarrassment and anxiety they had caused. His concern about animal welfare led to significant improvements in how the royal menagerie was maintained, with better food, housing, medical care, and enrichment activities for all the creatures under his care. Charles's animal anxiety also contributed to his becoming an early supporter of scientific research into animal behavior and intelligence, funding studies that advanced understanding of animal cognition and establishing precedents for humane treatment of captive animals that influenced zoological practices for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, Charles's talking animal dreams humanized him in ways that made him more relatable and appealing to his subjects. Stories about the king's pet anxieties spread throughout England, and people found it endearing that their monarch was worried about what his dogs thought of him. It created a more personal connection between Charles and ordinary people who also had complicated relationships with their animals. The psychological lesson of Charles's animal dreams seems to be that even kings can benefit from the honest feedback that pets provide, even if that feedback only exists in their unconscious minds. His dreams forced him to confront his personal shortcomings and motivated him to make genuine improvements in his behavior and lifestyle, ultimately making him a better person and a more effective ruler. Charles's case also demonstrates how guilt and self-awareness can manifest in unexpected ways, with the unconscious mind using familiar and beloved figures to deliver psychological insights that might be difficult to accept from human sources. His animals became safe vehicles for self-criticism because their love was unconditional in ways that human relationships often aren't. When your dreams turn your pets into your harshest critics, you're probably dealing with some serious self-esteem issues and unconscious awareness of areas where you could improve your personal conduct. But Charles II's talking animal nightmares also show us that sometimes our unconscious minds use the figures we love most to help us become better versions of ourselves. The modern psychological understanding of Charles's animal dreams would probably focus on how they represented his superego expressing itself through figures that he associated with unconditional love and acceptance. His pets provided a safe way for his unconscious mind to explore his personal shortcomings without threatening his fundamental sense of self-worth or his relationships with politically important people. When your dreams feature beloved animals delivering moral lectures about your lifestyle choices, you're experiencing a form of psychological growth that allows you to maintain your dignity, while still confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself. Charles II's talking animal dreams ultimately helped him become a more self-aware, considerate, and effective ruler while preserving his ego and his genuine love for his pets. Empress Catherine the Great of Russia had one of the most sexually embarrassing recurring dreams in royal history, and the fact that we know about it reveals both her unusual openness about intimate matters and the complete lack of privacy that surrounded even the most personal aspects of royal life in 18th century Europe. These dreams were so awkward that they became the subject of diplomatic gossip across European courts and contributed to some of the most persistent and malicious rumors about Catherine's private life that lasted for centuries. Catherine's nightmare involved a giant horse that would chase her through the Winter Palace while making increasingly specific and inappropriate romantic advances, speaking in perfect French and delivering elaborate courtly love speeches that were simultaneously ridiculous and terrifying. Now, you have to understand that in 18th century Europe, there were already vicious rumors about Catherine's alleged romantic relationship with horses, most of which were completely fabricated propaganda created by her enemies to undermine her authority. So having horse-related sexual dreams was basically her worst nightmare come to life. The historical context here is crucial for understanding why these dreams were so psychologically devastating for Catherine. She was a German princess who had married into the Russian royal family and eventually overthrown her own husband, Peter III, to become empress in her own right. This made her vulnerable to attacks about her legitimacy, her foreignness, and her femininity that were often expressed through sexual rumors and innuendo designed to destroy her reputation and political authority. Catherine was also living in an era when female sexuality was simultaneously feared and fascinating to European society. Powerful women who expressed sexual desires or had multiple relationships were often portrayed as unnatural, dangerous, or literally in league with demonic forces. The idea of a female ruler who was sexually active was threatening to traditional gender hierarchies, and Catherine's enemies exploited these anxieties through increasingly elaborate and disgusting sexual rumors. The horse rumors specifically played into ancient European folklore that connected female sexual power with bestiality and witchcraft. These weren't just random slanders, they were carefully crafted propaganda designed to tap into deep cultural fears about women who wielded political power and sexual agency simultaneously. Catherine understood that these rumors could destroy her legitimacy, more effectively than military defeats or political failures. But Catherine's actual dreams were far more complex and psychologically revealing than the crude propaganda suggested. In her private letters to her close friend Madame Geoffrin in Paris, Catherine described these recurring nightmares with surprising detail, humor, and psychological insight that shows she understood exactly what was happening to her unconscious mind and why these particular anxieties were manifesting in her sleep. The dreams always started the same way. Catherine would be hosting an elegant court function at the Winter Palace, wearing her most magnificent royal gown surrounded by foreign ambassadors, Russian nobles, and important political figures. Everything would be perfectly civilized and dignified, with Catherine demonstrating her mastery of European court etiquette and her sophisticated understanding of international diplomacy. These dream court functions were always representations of Catherine's greatest political achievements, successful diplomatic negotiations, cultural celebrations that showcased Russian sophistication, or ceremonial events that demonstrated her legitimate authority as Empress of Russia. In her dreams, she was performing exactly the kind of enlightened, cosmopolitan leadership that she had worked so hard to establish in reality. But then, suddenly and without warning, a massive stallion would burst through the ornate palace doors and begin pursuing Catherine with obvious and increasingly aggressive romantic intentions. This wasn't just any horse. Catherine's dream journals describe a creature that was unnaturally large, magnificently beautiful, and somehow both terrifying and irresistibly attractive simultaneously. The dream horse would speak in perfect French, because apparently even in her nightmares, Catherine maintained some standards about education and sophistication. But instead of the crude sexual advances that her enemies' propaganda suggested, the horse would deliver elaborate, romantic speeches using the most sophisticated courtly love language of 18th century European culture. In her letters to Madame Geoffrin, Catherine described how the horse would make declarations like, "Your Imperial Majesty, your beauty surpasses the aurora borealis over the Russian steppes, and your intelligence illuminates the darkness of ignorance like the sun over Versailles. I am compelled by forces beyond mortal understanding to declare my passionate devotion to your incomparable person." The psychological complexity of these dreams was extraordinary. The horse represented everything that Catherine found attractive about power, beauty, and masculine energy, but also everything that terrified her about losing control, being overwhelmed by forces beyond her rational management, and being reduced to her sexuality rather than respected for her political intelligence. What made these dreams particularly mortifying for Catherine was that they occurred during a period when she was trying to establish herself as an enlightened, rational ruler who could compete intellectually with the great male monarchs of Europe like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Joseph II of Austria. She was corresponding with Voltaire, supporting the Encyclopedia, and promoting educational reforms that would modernize Russian society and demonstrate her commitment to Enlightenment principles. Having romantic horse dreams was exactly the kind of thing that would reinforce every sexist stereotype about female rulers being governed by irrational passions rather than logical thinking. Catherine understood that if these dreams became public knowledge, they would be used as evidence that women were fundamentally unfit for political leadership because they were controlled by their sexual desires rather than their rational faculties. The dreams also revealed Catherine's deep anxieties about the intersection of her political power and her personal sexuality. She was a woman who had multiple lovers throughout her life and was unapologetic about her sexual desires. But she also understood that her sexual behavior was constantly scrutinized and used to attack her political legitimacy in ways that male rulers never experienced. Catherine became so anxious about these horse dreams that she started avoiding horses during her waking hours, which was extremely problematic for an 18th century ruler. Horses were essential for military inspections, ceremonial parades, diplomatic hunts, and basic transportation around her vast empire. A Russian empress who couldn't or wouldn't ride horses was like a naval commander who was afraid of ships. Her courtiers and military advisors were baffled when Catherine suddenly started requesting carriages for trips that would normally require horseback riding. She began making excuses to avoid military reviews where she would be expected to ride among her troops, delegating these responsibilities to male relatives or simply canceling important ceremonial events that involved equestrian displays. Foreign ambassadors noted Catherine's apparent reluctance to participate in hunting expeditions and outdoor ceremonies that had previously been highlights of diplomatic visits to the Russian court. The French ambassador wrote to Versailles that the Russian empress seemed to have developed an inexplicable aversion to horses that affects her participation in normal court activities. The psychological impact of these horse dreams on Catherine was significant enough that she consulted with court physicians about whether there might be medical explanations for recurring romantic dreams about inappropriate partners. Dr. Johann Zimmermann, a German physician who served the Russian court, suggested various treatments including changes in diet, exercise routines, and even bloodletting to balance what he believed were Catherine's excessive passionate humors. But Catherine was too intellectually curious and scientifically minded to accept simple medical explanations for her psychological experiences. She began studying dream interpretation texts from various cultures, trying to understand whether her horse dreams might have symbolic rather than literal meaning that could provide insights into her unconscious mind and political anxieties. Catherine corresponded with leading Enlightenment philosophers including Denis, Diderot, and Baron d'Holbach about the relationship between dreams and subconscious desires, essentially turning her embarrassing nightmares into academic research that contributed to early psychological theory. Her letters reveal sophisticated understanding of how political pressure and social expectations might manifest in dream content that reflected deeper psychological conflicts. In her correspondence with Voltaire, Catherine explored whether her horse dreams might represent her unconscious mind's attempt to process the contradiction between her need to project rational, masculine authority as a ruler and her desire to maintain her feminine identity and sexual agency as a woman. She theorized that the horse might symbolize the powerful, uncontrolled forces that she had to manage as an autocratic ruler. The most humiliating aspect of Catherine's horse dreams was that they started affecting her diplomatic relationships and international reputation. Foreign courts began making subtle jokes about Russian equestrian traditions, and some European diplomats started using horse imagery in their communications with Russia as a form of sophisticated mockery. The British ambassador to St. Petersburg reported to London that the Russian court seems unusually sensitive to equestrian references, and one must be careful about metaphors involving horses when discussing diplomatic matters. French courtiers at Versailles began making elaborate jokes about Russian writing techniques that were clearly references to the sexual rumors surrounding Catherine. Catherine tried various strategies to stop the horse dreams, including changing her sleeping arrangements, avoiding certain foods that might trigger vivid dreams, and even experimenting with different types of bedding and room temperatures. She commissioned court artists to create paintings of horses in dignified, non-romantic contexts, hoping that exposure to appropriate equestrian art might reprogram her unconscious mind. She also began reading classical literature that featured horses in heroic rather than romantic contexts, studying military histories that emphasized the practical rather than sexual aspects of horsemanship, and even commissioning scholarly treatises on equine behavior that might provide rational, scientific frameworks for understanding horses as animals rather than romantic symbols. But perhaps most tellingly, Catherine began implementing changes in court protocol that would minimize her exposure to horses and horse-related imagery during her daily royal activities. She redesigned ceremonial events to reduce equestrian elements, commissioned new transportation options that would allow her to participate in outdoor activities without riding, and even changed the decorative themes in her private apartments to avoid horse motifs. The dreams finally stopped when Catherine took decisive action to separate her public and private lives more clearly and to assert greater control over her personal environment and daily schedule. She established strict protocols about who could enter her private quarters, when palace functions would end, and how her personal time would be protected from court intrusions and political pressures. Catherine also began working with trusted female advisors to develop strategies for managing the psychological pressures of female rule that male monarchs didn't experience. She created what might be the first systematic approach to managing the intersection of gender, sexuality, and political authority that helped her maintain her mental health while continuing to rule effectively. This increased privacy and psychological support seemed to reduce the anxiety and stress that were fueling her inappropriate horse dreams. Catherine later wrote that her nightmares had taught her important lessons about the relationship between public pressure and private psychological health, and about the need for female rulers to protect their personal lives from the constant scrutiny that could be psychologically devastating. Catherine became an advocate for royal privacy rights and established precedents that protected future Russian rulers from excessive public intrusion into their personal lives and private relationships. She argued that rulers needed psychological space and personal autonomy to function effectively, and that constant public scrutiny could undermine political effectiveness by creating anxiety and paranoia. The lasting impact of Catherine's horse dreams on her reign was actually quite positive, despite the embarrassment and anxiety they caused. Her experience with managing the psychological pressures of female rule led her to develop more sophisticated approaches to court politics, diplomatic relations, and personal relationship management that made her a more effective leader. Catherine's horse anxiety also contributed to her becoming more supportive of other women who face similar challenges with sexual rumors and gender-based political attacks. She developed policies that protected women from certain types of sexual harassment and defamation, and she used her own experience to understand how gender-based political attacks could be psychologically devastating even for powerful women. But perhaps most importantly, Catherine's horse dreams forced her to confront the fundamental contradictions and impossible expectations that European society placed on female rulers. She had to be sexually attractive enough to maintain diplomatic alliances and court loyalty, but not so sexual that she appeared immoral or uncontrolled. She had to be feminine enough to be acceptable as a woman, but masculine enough to be credible as a ruler. These contradictions were literally unsustainable from a psychological perspective, and Catherine's dreams represented her unconscious mind's attempt to process pressures that were fundamentally impossible to resolve through conscious rational thinking. The horse dreams were symptoms of broader social problems about gender and power that affected all women in positions of authority. Catherine's correspondence reveals that she eventually understood her horse dreams as evidence of the need for broader social changes in how European society understood female sexuality, political authority, and the relationship between personal life and public leadership. She became an advocate for what we might now recognize as early feminist ideas about women's rights to sexual autonomy and political authority. The irony of Catherine's horse dreams is that they revealed her to be far more psychologically sophisticated and self-aware than most of her male contemporaries. While other rulers were content to accept traditional explanations for their psychological experiences, Catherine turned her embarrassing dreams into opportunities for intellectual growth and social analysis that contributed to Enlightenment psychology and political theory. Her willingness to discuss her sexual dreams with trusted correspondents and to analyze their psychological significance was remarkably advanced for the 18th century. Most rulers, male or female, would have tried to suppress or ignore such experiences, but Catherine treated them as valuable sources of information about her own psychological state and the social pressures affecting her reign. Modern psychologists who have studied Catherine's case recognize her horse dreams as classic examples of how impossible social expectations can manifest in unconscious anxiety that reveals the fundamental contradictions in the dreamer's life situation. Her dreams were essentially her unconscious mind's way of highlighting problems that couldn't be solved through individual psychological adjustment but required broader social change. Catherine's story also demonstrates how personal psychological struggles can sometimes lead to positive political and social developments when the person experiencing them has the power and opportunity to address the underlying social conditions that create those struggles. Her horse anxiety contributed to policies and cultural changes that made life easier for other women, turning her personal psychological pain into broader social progress. When your dreams about inappropriate romantic partners become international diplomatic incidents and inspire you to develop new theories about the relationship between gender, sexuality, and political authority, You're dealing with psychological pressures that reveal fundamental problems in how your society understands power, identity, and human relationships. Catherine the Great's horse dreams show us that even the most powerful and accomplished women can be psychologically tormented by social expectations that are literally impossible to fulfill, but they also demonstrate how personal psychological insight can contribute to broader social understanding and progressive political change. Napoleon Bonaparte, already sensitive about his height, he wasn't actually that short by 18th century standards, but the propaganda stuck, had recurring nightmares where he would shrink smaller and smaller during important military reviews until he completely disappeared, leaving only his iconic hat sitting on the ground while his armies searched frantically for their missing emperor. And the really psychologically devastating part was that these dreams occurred during the absolute peak of his power, when Napoleon should have felt most confident about his abilities and position. Now, you have to understand that the whole Napoleon was short thing is one of history's most persistent myths. He was actually about 5'7", which was perfectly average for French men in the early 1800s. The confusion came from differences between French and English measurements, plus the fact that his enemies found it politically useful to portray him as a tiny man with delusions of grandeur. But by the time Napoleon was having these shrinking dreams, the height jokes had become so widespread that even he was starting to internalize them. The dreams always began with Napoleon at the height of his glory, literally and figuratively. He would be conducting a grand military review, maybe at Austerlitz or during one of his other famous victories, dressed in his full imperial regalia with the famous bicorn hat, the ornate uniform dripping with medals and decorations, standing tall and commanding before thousands of soldiers who worshipped him like a god. But then, as he would begin addressing his troops or reviewing their formations, Napoleon would notice that something was wrong. The soldiers would start looking down at him with barely concealed amusement, and he would realize that he was gradually getting smaller. Not all at once, that would have been merciful. Instead, he would shrink inch by inch while trying to maintain his imperial dignity and continue conducting military business. The psychological torture of these dreams came from Napoleon's desperate attempts to compensate for his shrinking stature while pretending that nothing was happening. He would try standing on his tiptoes, climbing onto makeshift platforms, or positioning himself behind objects that might hide his diminishing height. But nothing worked, and his efforts to conceal his condition only made his situation more ridiculous and pathetic. As Napoleon continued to shrink, his famous uniform would become increasingly oversized and comical. His bicorn hat would slip down over his eyes, his jacket would hang like a tent around his tiny frame, and his sword would drag on the ground behind him like some kind of bizarre royal tale. The soldiers would begin snickering, then openly laughing at their emperor's transformation from conqueror of Europe to tiny man drowning in his own clothes. But the worst part of these shrinking dreams was that Napoleon would maintain his grandiose personality and imperial ambitions even as he became physically smaller and smaller. He would continue trying to give commanding speeches and issue strategic orders while his voice became higher and squeakier, and while his gestures became increasingly ineffective due to his diminished size. Napoleon would attempt to mount his famous horse Marengo, only to discover that he was now too small to reach the stirrups. He would try to point decisively at maps and battle plans, but his tiny hands couldn't span the distances between cities and his miniature fingers couldn't hold the heavy military instruments. Everything that had made him an effective military leader became impossible once he started shrinking. The dreams always ended the same way. Napoleon would eventually become so small that he would completely disappear, leaving only his empty uniform and iconic hat sitting on the ground while his confused army searched frantically for their missing emperor. The soldiers would be calling his name, looking under rocks and behind trees, while Napoleon would be screaming orders that no one could hear because his voice had become too tiny to register. These shrinking dreams were particularly devastating for Napoleon because they occurred during 1805 to 1807, when he was at the absolute peak of his military and political success. He had defeated the combined armies of Austria and Russia at Austerlitz, conquered most of continental Europe, and established himself as the most powerful man in the world. This should have been the period when he felt most confident about his capabilities and position. But instead, his unconscious mind was apparently torturing him with scenarios where his physical stature undermined all his actual achievements. It was as if his sleeping brain was saying, "Sure, you've conquered Europe, but what if everyone's just secretly laughing at your height?" The dreams revealed deep insecurities that persisted despite his unprecedented success. Napoleon became so anxious about these shrinking dreams that he started implementing compensatory measures in his real life that were both obvious and kind of pathetic. He began wearing specially designed boots with hidden platforms that added several inches to his height, commissioning portraits that emphasized his stature relative to other figures, and even redesigning military ceremonies to minimize situations where his height might be unfavorably compared to taller officers. The emperor also started surrounding himself with shorter staff members and advisors, apparently hoping that being the tallest person in the room would provide psychological reassurance about his physical presence. Foreign diplomats noted that Napoleon's inner circle seemed unusually short, and some suspected that height had become an unofficial qualification for imperial service. Napoleon's shrinking anxiety also influenced his military strategy in subtle but significant ways. He became reluctant to conduct military reviews on foot, preferring to remain mounted on his horse where his height would be less obvious. He also started positioning himself strategically during battles and ceremonies, to maximize the visual impact of his presence while minimizing opportunities for unfavorable height comparisons. But perhaps most tellingly, Napoleon began commissioning artists and sculptors to create images that emphasized his commanding presence and imperial authority, rather than his physical accuracy. The famous propaganda portraits from this period show Napoleon as taller, more imposing, and more physically commanding than he actually was, essentially creating visual arguments against the kind of physical diminishment that he experienced in his dreams. The psychological impact of these shrinking dreams extended beyond simple vanity to affect Napoleon's understanding of leadership and authority. He became increasingly focused on the symbolic and ceremonial aspects of imperial power, developing elaborate protocols and rituals designed to emphasize his larger-than-life status despite his average physical stature. Napoleon's response to his height anxiety also influenced the development of the Napoleonic Code and other legal reforms that emphasized merit and achievement over inherited social status. Some historians argue that his sensitivity about physical characteristics contributed to his support for legal systems that judged people based on their capabilities, rather than their appearance or family background. The irony of Napoleon's shrinking dreams is that they revealed a man who was simultaneously the most powerful person in Europe and deeply insecure about something as trivial as his height. His unconscious mind was apparently immune to his actual achievements and continued to focus on perceived physical inadequacies that had no real impact on his ability to rule an empire. These dreams eventually stopped around 1808, coinciding with Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria and his establishment of a stable imperial dynasty. Some psychologists who have studied his case suggest that the shrinking nightmares represented his unconscious fears about whether his power was based on genuine authority or just temporary military success that could disappear as quickly as it had appeared. Napoleon's shrinking dreams also reveal the psychological costs of living in a propaganda-saturated environment where his enemies constantly attacked his physical appearance and personal characteristics. Even someone with his extraordinary self-confidence and actual achievements could be psychologically affected by persistent ridicule about his height. The lasting impact of Napoleon's height anxiety can be seen in how carefully he managed his public image and how much effort he put into creating visual representations that emphasized his imperial authority. His sensitivity about physical stature contributed to some of the most iconic imagery of the Napoleonic era, as he worked to counteract his shrinking dreams through increasingly grand and imposing artistic and ceremonial presentations. Marie Antoinette had recurring dreams where she was trapped in an enormous pastry shop that stretched infinitely in all directions, filled with cakes, breads, and confections that she was somehow responsible for eating completely. And the really psychologically torturous part was that these dreams occurred during the period when France was experiencing bread shortages and economic crisis, making them the most guilt-inducing nightmares imaginable for a queen who was already being blamed for the country's financial problems. Picture this. It's 1788. France is on the brink of revolution. People are literally starving in the streets. And the queen is having dreams about being force-fed pastries in an infinite bakery. The irony wasn't lost on her unconscious mind, and these dreams became a nightly reminder of the massive disconnect between royal luxury and popular suffering that was about to destroy the French monarchy. The dreams always started the same way. Marie Antoinette would find herself in what appeared to be the most magnificent pastry shop ever created, with elaborate displays of croissants, eclairs, macarons, and towering croque-monsieur pyramids that seemed to stretch up to the ceiling and beyond. Everything was perfectly crafted, beautifully decorated, and absolutely delicious looking in that way that only dream food can be. But instead of being a pleasant fantasy about unlimited sweets, these dreams quickly turned into psychological torture. Marie Antoinette would realize that she was somehow responsible for consuming every single pastry in the infinite shop, and that hungry peasants were standing outside the windows watching her struggle to eat her way through mountains of luxury foods. The peasants in her dreams weren't angry or threatening, they were just sadly watching through the glass, their faces pressed against the windows as they observed their queen attempting to consume pastries that kept regenerating faster than she could eat them. Their expressions were more disappointed than furious, which somehow made the whole situation even more psychologically devastating. Marie Antoinette would try to invite the peasants inside to share the pastries, but the doors and windows of the dream bakery were always locked from the inside, trapping her with the infinite food while keeping the hungry people outside. She would pound on the glass, trying to break it so she could share the abundance, but the windows were unbreakable and soundproof. The pastries themselves seemed to mock her situation by becoming increasingly elaborate and expensive looking as the dream progressed. Simple bread would transform into ornate wedding cakes. Basic cookies would morph into jewel-encrusted confections, and everything would be decorated with gold leaf and precious stones that made the food even more obviously luxurious and inappropriate given the economic crisis outside. What made these dreams particularly torturous was that Marie Antoinette would become progressively more nauseated and uncomfortable as she tried to eat her way through the infinite pastries. But she couldn't stop consuming them because somehow the hungry peasants' survival seemed to depend on her finishing everything. It was like a twisted version of helping others through personal sacrifice. Except the sacrifice was meaningless and the help never actually reached the people who needed it. The psychological context of these dreams is crucial for understanding their impact on Marie Antoinette. By 1788, she was already deeply aware that her lifestyle and spending habits were contributing to France's financial crisis, and she was struggling with genuine guilt about the suffering that her actions had helped cause. The pastry dreams were essentially her unconscious mind's way of forcing her to confront the moral implications of royal luxury during a period of popular hardship. Marie Antoinette's real relationship with food and luxury had become increasingly complicated as the economic crisis deepened. She had already begun reducing her personal expenses, simplifying court ceremonies, and trying to adopt a more modest lifestyle that would be less offensive to struggling French citizens. But these efforts felt inadequate given the scale of the problems facing the country. The infinite pastry shop dreams also reflected Marie Antoinette's growing awareness that no amount of personal sacrifice on her part could actually solve France's systemic economic problems. Even if she gave up all her luxuries and lived like a peasant, it wouldn't address the fundamental structural issues that were causing widespread poverty and hunger. In her dream journals, Marie Antoinette described the frustration of being trapped in situations where she was expected to solve problems that were beyond any individual's capacity to fix. The infinite pastries represented impossible expectations. No matter how much she consumed, there would always be more, and the hungry people outside would never actually be fed. The dreams also revealed Marie Antoinette's deep loneliness and isolation during the pre-revolutionary period. Even in her nightmares, she was separated from the French people by barriers that she couldn't break through. The locked windows of the pastry shop represented the social and political isolation that made it impossible for her to connect with her subjects or understand their real needs and concerns. Marie Antoinette became so disturbed by these pastry dreams that she started avoiding elaborate desserts and reducing the number of courses served at royal dinners. She also began visiting Parisian bakeries in disguise, trying to understand the realities of food shortages and bread prices that were affecting ordinary French families. These incognito bakery visits were both touching and kind of pathetic. Here was the Queen of France, wearing simple clothes and trying to blend in with regular customers, desperately attempting to understand problems that her own lifestyle had helped create. The bakers and customers had no idea they were serving royalty, which gave Marie Antoinette genuine insights into how ordinary people viewed the economic crisis. But the pastry dreams also inspired some positive changes in Marie Antoinette's behavior and priorities. She began supporting charitable organizations that provided food for poor families, established programs that supplied free bread during particularly difficult periods, and even convinced Louis XVI to implement some economic reforms that reduced royal expenses. The infinite pastry nightmares finally stopped in early 1789, around the time when Marie Antoinette had fully committed to supporting more substantial political and economic reforms. Some psychologists who have studied her case suggest that the dreams ended when she accepted that addressing France's problems would require fundamental changes to the monarchical system rather than just personal lifestyle adjustments. The psychological legacy of Marie Antoinette's pastry dreams can be seen in how she approached the early stages of the French Revolution. Unlike many aristocrats who remained completely oblivious to popular concerns, she had developed some genuine understanding of the economic hardships facing ordinary French people, partly through the guilt and awareness generated by her nightmares. Marie Antoinette's infinite pastry dreams also reveal something important about the psychology of privilege and the emotional costs of living with wealth during periods of widespread suffering. Even people who benefit from unfair social systems can experience genuine psychological distress when they become aware of the suffering that their advantages have helped cause. The tragic irony of Marie Antoinette's story is that her pastry dreams showed she was capable of developing genuine empathy and social awareness, but this personal growth came too late to save her from the political consequences of her earlier behavior. Her unconscious mind understood the moral problems with royal luxury during economic crisis, but her conscious political responses were inadequate to address the revolutionary situation that was already developing. Modern psychologists who study guilt and social responsibility recognize Marie Antoinette's pastry dreams as examples of how privilege can create psychological conflict when people become aware of the costs that their advantages impose on others. Her nightmares represented a form of moral awakening that was both psychologically healthy and politically irrelevant given the historical circumstances. When your dreams trap you in infinite luxury while hungry people watch helplessly from outside, you're probably dealing with some serious guilt about social inequality and your role in perpetuating unfair systems. Marie Antoinette's pastry nightmares show us that even people who benefit from injustice can experience genuine psychological torment when they develop awareness of the suffering that their privilege has caused. Henry VIII, in his later years, had increasingly frequent dreams where all 6 of his wives would appear simultaneously to critique his romantic and leadership abilities. And these ghost wife dreams were particularly disturbing because they occurred after he had executed 2 of them and divorced several others, under controversial circumstances that had torn apart the English church and created international diplomatic crises. Now, you have to understand that by the time Henry was having these dreams, around 1545, just 2 years before his death, he was a psychological and physical wreck. This was a man who had started his reign as a handsome, athletic, intellectually curious Renaissance prince, but had transformed into an obese, paranoid, possibly syphilitic tyrant whose personal relationships had become international political disasters. The dreams always featured the same setup. Henry would find himself in a grand throne room, but instead of his usual courtiers and advisors, All 6 of his wives would be seated in chairs arranged in a semicircle around his throne, like some kind of supernatural marriage counseling session from hell. And they weren't there to provide comfort or companionship. They were there to deliver devastating critiques of his behavior as both a husband and a king. And Bullen and Catherine Howard would appear with their heads clearly detached from their necks, holding them in their laps like grotesque accessories while speaking in perfectly normal voices about Henry's character flaws and political mistakes. The visual was both horrifying and absurd. Imagine trying to have a serious conversation about your relationship problems with someone whose head is sitting in their lap, making direct eye contact with you. Anne Boleyn would typically begin these dream confrontations by saying things like, "Henry, darling, I must point out that executing your wives when you become bored with them is not actually a sustainable approach to marriage, and it's creating some rather unfortunate precedents for royal behavior." Her tone was always reasonable and conversational, which somehow made the whole situation even more unsettling than if she had been angry or accusatory. Catherine Howard, being younger and more direct, would usually follow up with more blunt observations about Henry's romantic techniques and personal hygiene. She would say things like, "Your Majesty, I feel compelled to mention that your seduction methods have become increasingly creepy over the years, and your personal odor is frankly challenging for those of us with sensitive ghostly sensibilities." Now, this was particularly devastating for Henry because by his later years, his legendary charm and physical attractiveness had completely deteriorated. He was suffering from what were probably multiple chronic infections. His leg ulcers were constantly suppurating and smelly, and his weight had ballooned to the point where he needed mechanical assistance to move around. The contrast between his younger self and his current condition was painfully obvious even to him. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, would take a different approach, focusing on the political and religious consequences of Henry's marriage decisions. She would deliver learned lectures about the validity of their marriage, the theological problems with his break from Rome, and the long-term consequences of subordinating religious principle to personal convenience. Catherine would say things like, "Henry, my dear, your decision to declare our marriage invalid has created a schism in Christendom that will have consequences for centuries. Perhaps your personal desires should have been weighed against the spiritual welfare of millions of souls." Her tone was always more disappointed than angry, which made her criticisms even more psychologically penetrating. Jane Seymour, who had died in childbirth after giving Henry his only legitimate male heir, would focus on his failures as a father and his treatment of their son Edward. She would express concerns about Edward's health, his education, and the political instability that Henry's marriage chaos had created for the future of the Tudor dynasty. Jane would say things like, "Henry, our son needs stability and wise guidance, but your behavior has created a court environment that's more like a dangerous political soap opera than a proper royal household. How is the poor child supposed to learn effective leadership when his father's marriage is read like a cautionary tale about absolute power?" Anne of Cleves, who had survived her marriage to Henry through the clever strategy of accepting an annulment gracefully and remaining on good terms with him, would typically mock his appearance and personal habits while also critiquing his political judgment. Her approach was more sarcastic and humorous than the others, but no less cutting. Anne would make observations like, "Henry, darling, I must say that your current physical condition makes our brief marriage look like a lucky escape for both of us. Also, your tendency to execute people when you're frustrated is really becoming quite predictable and boring. Couldn't you develop some more creative approaches to conflict resolution?" Catherine Parr, his 6th and final wife, who was still alive during these dreams, would appear as a living person among the ghosts, which created an additional layer of surreal horror. She would critique Henry's current behavior and their ongoing marriage, while the spirits of his previous wives provided commentary and comparison. Catherine Parr would say things like, "Henry, I'm trying to be a supportive wife, but it's rather difficult when I'm constantly wondering whether I'll join these ladies in their current state if I accidentally annoy you. Also, your mood swings are making court life quite stressful for everyone involved." What made these ghost wife dreams particularly psychologically devastating for Henry was that they forced him to confront the cumulative impact of his romantic and political decisions from the perspective of the women who had been most directly affected by his choices. Each wife represented a different aspect of his failures: personal, political, religious, and dynastic. The dreams also highlighted the impossibility of Henry's situation in his later years. He was trapped in a body that was failing, a political system that he had destabilized through his marriage chaos, and a religious landscape that he had fundamentally altered for personal reasons. The ghost wives represented all the consequences of his earlier decisions coming back to haunt him literally and figuratively. Henry would wake up from these dreams feeling guilty and defensive, which contributed to his increasingly paranoid and unstable behavior during his final years. He started avoiding certain rooms in his palaces where the dreams seemed most likely to occur, and he commissioned priests to perform blessing ceremonies to ward off what he believed might be genuine ghostly visitations. The king also began having his current wife, Catherine Parr, checked on multiple times during the night to make sure she was still alive and hadn't joined the supernatural wife critique committee that was tormenting his sleep. Catherine Parr later wrote that Henry would sometimes wake her up just to confirm that she was still breathing and hadn't been murdered in her sleep. Henry's ghost wife dreams also influenced his approach to his final marriage and his relationships with his children. He became more attentive to Catherine Parr's opinions and more concerned about the welfare of his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, partly because the dream wives had forced him to confront the consequences of his parental failures. The psychological legacy of these dreams can be seen in Henry's last will and testament, which made careful provisions for all his children and attempted to restore some stability to the succession that his marriage chaos had disrupted. The ghost wives had apparently convinced him that his personal choices had created problems that extended far beyond his own lifetime. Most importantly, Henry's ghost wife dreams reveal the psychological costs of treating other people as disposable when they become inconvenient. His unconscious mind understood that his marriages had been political and personal disasters that had caused enormous suffering, and his dreams forced him to confront these moral implications during his final years. The tragic irony of Henry VIII's ghostwife dreams is that they showed he was capable of understanding the human consequences of his actions, but this awareness came too late to undo the damage he had caused. His unconscious mind had developed a more sophisticated moral compass than his conscious political behavior had ever demonstrated. When your dreams feature the decapitated heads of your executed wives delivering relationship advice, you're probably dealing with some serious guilt about your treatment of the people who trusted you most. Henry VIII's ghostwife nightmares show us that even absolute monarchs can be psychologically tormented by the consequences of their cruelest decisions. Modern psychologists who study guilt and moral development recognize Henry's ghostwife dreams as examples of how the unconscious mind can force people to confront the ethical implications of their behavior even when their conscious minds are defended against such awareness. His nightmares represented a form of psychological justice that his legal and political systems had failed to provide. Cleopatra VII had recurring nightmares about losing her famous beauty overnight and having to maintain her political power through intelligence and charisma alone, and while this might seem like a positive message about inner strength and intellectual capability, for Cleopatra it was absolutely terrifying because she understood better than anyone how much her physical appearance contributed to her diplomatic and romantic strategies for keeping Egypt independent. Now, you have to understand that Cleopatra wasn't actually the stunning beauty that Hollywood has made her out to be. Ancient sources suggest she was reasonably attractive, but not extraordinarily so. Her real power came from her intelligence, education, charisma, and her ability to speak 9 languages fluently. But in the political world of the 1st century BCE, where a female ruler needed every possible advantage to survive, physical attractiveness was definitely part of her strategic toolkit. Cleopatra's beauty dreams always began the same way. She would wake up in her palace in Alexandria, prepare for her daily routine of political meetings and diplomatic functions, but when she looked in her mirrors, she would discover that she had aged decades overnight. Not gradually, not subtly, but dramatically and obviously, with gray hair, deeply wrinkled skin, missing teeth, and all the physical deterioration that she associated with losing her political effectiveness. But here's where the dreams got psychologically complex. Cleopatra didn't just become old and ugly in her nightmares. She became specifically unattractive in ways that would undermine her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the Roman leaders whose romantic and political support were essential for Egypt's survival as an independent kingdom. In her dreams, she would still need to seduce Mark Antony and negotiate with Roman senators to protect Egypt's independence, but she would have to do it while looking like a grandmother. The psychological torture came from watching these powerful Roman men lose interest in her political proposals as soon as they saw her aged appearance, no matter how brilliant her arguments or how important her diplomatic offers. The dreams forced Cleopatra to confront her deepest anxieties about the temporary nature of physical beauty as a political tool and the fundamental unfairness of a world where women's intellectual capabilities were often ignored if they weren't also physically attractive. She understood that her beauty was essentially a diplomatic resource that was constantly depreciating, and that she needed backup strategies for when it was no longer sufficient to maintain her power. What made these aging dreams particularly terrifying for Cleopatra was their realism about how Roman political culture actually worked. Roman men, especially powerful ones like Caesar and Antony, were notorious for their superficial attitudes toward women and their tendency to lose interest in female partners once their physical attractiveness declined. Cleopatra's dreams accurately reflected the genuine political dangers she would face if she lost her appearance-based advantages. In her nightmare scenarios, Cleopatra would watch Mark Antony's attention wander to younger, more attractive women during crucial diplomatic negotiations, leaving Egypt vulnerable to Roman conquest because she could no longer maintain his romantic and political interest. She would see Roman senators dismissing her proposals not because they lacked merit, but because she no longer had the physical presence that made them take her seriously. The dreams also featured scenarios where Cleopatra would try to compensate for her lost beauty through increasingly elaborate makeup, clothing, and jewelry, but these efforts would only make her appear more desperate and pathetic. The aged Cleopatra in her nightmares would pile on cosmetics and ornaments that had worked when she was younger, but now made her look like a caricature of her former self. These beauty anxiety dreams revealed Cleopatra's sophisticated understanding of the intersection between personal appearance and political power in the ancient world. She knew that her physical attractiveness wasn't just vanity, it was a strategic asset that helped her maintain Egypt's independence by keeping powerful Roman leaders emotionally and politically invested in her success. Cleopatra became so disturbed by these aging dreams that she invested enormous resources in beauty treatments, cosmetics, and anti-aging remedies that went far beyond normal royal grooming. She employed teams of physicians, cosmetic specialists, and researchers who experimented with various treatments, designed to preserve her appearance and delay the aging process that she feared would destroy her political effectiveness. The famous stories about Cleopatra's elaborate beauty routines, bathing in milk and honey, using gold face masks and other exotic treatments, were partly motivated by her practical understanding that maintaining her appearance was essential for maintaining Egypt's political independence. Her beauty anxiety wasn't just personal vanity, it was national security policy. But Cleopatra also began developing backup political strategies that relied more on intellectual manipulation and economic leverage rather than physical attraction. She started building diplomatic relationships that were based on Egypt's wealth and strategic importance rather than her personal charm, essentially preparing for the day when her beauty would no longer be sufficient to maintain her power. These backup strategies included developing Egypt's economy to make the kingdom indispensable to Roman trade, building military alliances that didn't depend on her personal relationships with Roman leaders, and creating cultural and educational institutions that would give Egypt soft power beyond her own charisma. Cleopatra's aging dreams also motivated her to become more involved in training her children for political leadership, recognizing that Egypt's future couldn't depend entirely on her personal relationships with Roman men. She wanted to create institutional stability that would survive regardless of her own physical condition or romantic circumstances. The psychological impact of these beauty dreams extended to Cleopatra's approach to Roman culture and her presentation of Egyptian civilization. She began emphasizing the intellectual and cultural superiority of Egyptian civilization over Roman power, positioning herself as the representative of ancient wisdom and sophisticated culture rather than just an attractive exotic partner. Cleopatra started commissioning art and literature that portrayed her as a wise philosopher queen and the heir to thousands of years of Egyptian learning rather than just focusing on images that emphasized her physical beauty. She wanted to create a political identity that would remain powerful even if her appearance-based advantages disappeared. The aging dreams finally stopped around 37 BCE, when Cleopatra had successfully established her relationship with Mark Antony on a more stable political and personal foundation that went beyond simple physical attraction. She had also implemented enough backup political strategies that Egypt's independence was less dependent on her personal romantic relationships with Roman leaders. Some historians who have studied Cleopatra's case suggest that her beauty anxiety dreams represented her unconscious mind's way of forcing her to develop more sophisticated and sustainable approaches to political power. The nightmares motivated her to create backup systems that made her a more effective ruler, even if they were initially triggered by fears about losing her appearance. Cleopatra's beauty dreams also reveal something important about the additional psychological pressures faced by female political leaders who must navigate the intersection of gender, sexuality, and authority. Male rulers rarely had to worry about how aging would affect their political effectiveness, but female leaders like Cleopatra faced the constant anxiety that their power was tied to temporary physical characteristics. The modern psychological understanding of Cleopatra's case recognizes her beauty dreams as examples of how intelligent people can be motivated by anxiety to develop more robust and effective strategies for achieving their goals. Her nightmares about losing her appearance forced her to become a more well-rounded and capable leader who could maintain power through multiple different approaches. What makes Cleopatra's story particularly interesting is how she turned her anxiety about aging into motivation for political innovation. Instead of just trying to preserve her beauty indefinitely, she used her fears to develop new approaches to leadership that were less dependent on physical appearance and more sustainable over the long term. Cleopatra's beauty anxiety dreams ultimately made her a more effective ruler because they forced her to confront the limitations of appearance-based political strategies and develop alternative approaches that relied on her genuine intellectual and diplomatic capabilities. Her nightmares motivated her to become the kind of leader she was afraid she couldn't be without her beauty. The irony of Cleopatra's situation is that her fears about losing her physical attractiveness led her to develop political skills that were more impressive and historically significant than her appearance ever was. Her beauty anxiety dreams contributed to making her one of the most politically sophisticated and effective rulers of the ancient world. When your dreams about aging force you to develop backup plans that make you more capable and effective than you were when you were relying on temporary advantages, you're experiencing a form of anxiety that ultimately serves positive psychological and practical functions. Cleopatra's beauty nightmares show us how fears about losing superficial advantages can motivate people to develop more substantial and lasting capabilities. Modern female leaders who study Cleopatra's reign often identify with her beauty anxiety and the additional pressures that women face about maintaining their appearance while trying to be taken seriously for their intellectual and political abilities. Her story remains relevant because the intersection of gender, appearance, and authority continues to create psychological challenges for women in positions of power. Cleopatra's aging dreams remind us that even the most powerful and intelligent women can be psychologically affected by social systems that tie female authority to physical attractiveness. But they also demonstrate how such anxiety can be transformed into motivation for developing more sustainable and impressive forms of leadership. Now let's slow down a bit and talk about why royalty, throughout history, seems to have had such spectacularly embarrassing dreams. and why these dreams were often more psychologically revealing than anything their subjects ever learned about them through normal court observation. Because once you understand the historical and scientific framework behind royal embarrassing dreams, tonight's stories stop seeming like random historical anecdotes and start looking like windows into the fundamental psychological challenges of absolute power. The thing about being royalty is that you're essentially living in a fishbowl where every aspect of your public life is carefully choreographed and controlled. You can't show weakness, vulnerability, or genuine human emotion without it potentially undermining your authority. You can't admit ignorance, express doubt, or acknowledge personal flaws because doing so might encourage rebellion or invite foreign conquest. But dreams don't care about royal protocol or political consequences. They're like truth serum for your unconscious mind. Throughout history, different cultures have had vastly different approaches to royal dream interpretation and the significance of embarrassing royal dreams. These cultural differences reveal fascinating insights about how various societies understood the relationship between political power, psychological health, and divine authority. In ancient Egypt, Pharaoh's dreams were considered direct communications from the gods, so even embarrassing dream content had to be taken seriously and analyzed by teams of priests and scholars. The Egyptians didn't see royal humiliation dreams as evidence of personal weakness or unfitness to rule. They interpreted them as divine tests or spiritual lessons that the gods were providing to help their earthly representatives become better leaders. Egyptian dream interpretation texts, many of which survive on papyrus scrolls that are over 3,000 years old, include detailed protocols for analyzing royal embarrassment dreams. If a pharaoh dreamed about being ridiculed or humiliated, the priest interpreters would examine every detail to understand what the gods were trying to communicate about the pharaoh's spiritual development and political responsibilities. The Egyptians believed that embarrassing dreams served specific divine purposes. They were either tests of the pharaoh's humility, warnings about becoming too proud or disconnected from their subjects, or instructions about how to better serve both the gods and the Egyptian people. A pharaoh who dreamed about losing their royal regalia, for example, might be receiving divine guidance about the temporary nature of earthly power and the importance of maintaining proper spiritual perspective. What's fascinating about Egyptian royal dream interpretation is how sophisticated their psychological insights were, even though they explained everything in religious terms. They understood that powerful people needed psychological mechanisms for confronting their insecurities and moral failings, and they treated embarrassing dreams as healthy expressions of self-awareness rather than shameful weaknesses. Egyptian priests also recognized that royal isolation could create psychological problems that manifested in dream content. They noted that pharaohs who became too removed from ordinary human contact were more likely to have anxiety dreams about public humiliation, and they recommended regular interactions with common people as a form of psychological therapy that would reduce royal nightmare frequency. Ancient Chinese emperors had a completely different approach to embarrassing dreams that was based on the philosophical concept of the mandate of heaven. Chinese imperial ideology suggested that emperors ruled by divine approval, so dreams that made them look foolish or incompetent were potentially signs that heaven was withdrawing its support from the dynasty. Chinese court historians kept incredibly detailed records of imperial dreams, and patterns of embarrassing dream content were sometimes used to predict dynastic changes or interpret the spiritual health of the empire. If an emperor was having frequent anxiety dreams, it suggested that the cosmic balance was disturbed and needed to be restored through ritual, policy changes, or sometimes even abdication. What's remarkable about Chinese imperial dream interpretation is how seriously they took the idea that an emperor's subconscious mind could reflect the spiritual condition of the entire empire. They believed that individual psychological health and collective political stability were interconnected in ways that modern political science is only beginning to understand. Chinese dream analysis also recognized that different types of embarrassing dreams had different political implications. Dreams about personal humiliation might indicate that the emperor needed to cultivate greater humility and connection with his subjects. Dreams about losing imperial authority could suggest that heaven was preparing to transfer the mandate to a new dynasty. Dreams about moral failures might require specific rituals or policy reforms to restore cosmic harmony. Medieval European monarchs had yet another approach to royal dream, embarrassment that was heavily influenced by Christian theology. Church doctrine suggested that all dreams came from either divine, demonic, or natural sources. So, embarrassing royal dreams needed to be carefully analyzed to determine their spiritual significance and appropriate response. Church officials would interpret embarrassing royal dreams as either divine tests of humility, demonic attacks designed to undermine royal authority, or natural expressions of human sinfulness that even kings couldn't escape. This created a complex theological framework where royal embarrassment could be spiritually meaningful rather than just personally awkward. Medieval dream interpretation manuals included detailed instructions for distinguishing between different types of royal embarrassment dreams. Divine dreams were typically characterized by moral lessons and spiritual insights that helped rulers become better Christians and more effective leaders. Demonic dreams were usually designed to create doubt, fear, and spiritual confusion that would undermine the ruler's faith and political effectiveness. Natural dreams were understood as expressions of the ruler's human psychology and physical condition, providing insights into stress levels, health problems, and emotional needs that might require medical or spiritual attention. Medieval physicians often used royal dream content as diagnostic information that could guide their treatment recommendations. The medieval church also developed sophisticated theories about why rulers might be particularly vulnerable to embarrassing dreams. They understood that the isolation and pressure of absolute power could create psychological conditions that made kings and queens more susceptible to spiritual attacks and more likely to experience anxiety dreams about losing their authority. Islamic cultures had their own rich traditions around royal dream interpretation that emphasized the relationship between a ruler's personal spiritual development and their political effectiveness. In Islamic political theory, legitimate authority came from divine approval. So, embarrassing dreams were often seen as opportunities for rulers to confront their ego attachments and develop greater wisdom and compassion. The Ottoman Empire had court dream interpreters who specialized in helping sultans understand the spiritual lessons contained in their most humiliating nightmares. These scholars believe that Allah sometimes used embarrassing dreams to keep powerful rulers humble and remind them of their dependence on divine guidance rather than their own abilities. Islamic dream interpretation emphasized that embarrassing dreams could serve important spiritual functions by forcing rulers to acknowledge their human limitations and their need for divine assistance in governing effectively. A sultan who dreamed about being mocked or humiliated might be receiving divine instruction about the importance of seeking advice from wise counselors and maintaining connection with ordinary people. Ottoman dream interpreters also recognized that embarrassing dreams could provide valuable psychological insights about the ruler's mental and spiritual condition. They developed sophisticated methods for analyzing dream content to understand the sultan's emotional state, stress levels, and spiritual needs that might require attention from physicians, spiritual advisors, or policy reforms. Renaissance European courts began developing more psychological approaches to royal dream analysis, influenced by emerging scientific ideas about the relationship between mental and physical health. Embarrassing dreams were increasingly seen as symptoms of stress, guilt, or repressed emotions rather than just supernatural communications. Court physicians started documenting patterns in royal sleep disturbances and developing treatments that combined medical interventions with psychological counseling. This was the beginning of what we might recognize as primitive psychotherapy, specifically designed to help rulers deal with the unique stresses of absolute power. Renaissance dream analysis also incorporated new ideas from classical philosophy and early scientific thinking that emphasized the importance of understanding natural causes for psychological phenomena. While supernatural explanations weren't abandoned entirely, court physicians began exploring how diet, exercise, environment, and lifestyle factors might contribute to royal dream content. The humanist intellectual movement of the Renaissance also influenced royal dream. interpretation by emphasizing the psychological complexity and emotional needs of individual rulers. Instead of focusing primarily on political or spiritual implications, Renaissance analysts began paying more attention to how dreams reflected the personal psychology and human development of kings and queens. The Enlightenment brought much more rational approaches to understanding royal psychology and dream analysis. Philosophers and early psychologists began studying how the isolation and pressure of royal life might contribute to specific types of anxiety, dreams, and psychological disturbances that were predictable rather than supernatural. Voltaire wrote extensively about the relationship between political power and mental health, noting that absolute monarchs often developed anxiety disorders and paranoid thinking patterns that manifested in their dream lives. He argued that embarrassing royal dreams were actually evidence of remaining humanity in people who were often treated like gods by their subjects. Enlightenment thinkers also began exploring how the artificial social environment of royal courts might create psychological problems that wouldn't affect ordinary people. The constant flattery, political manipulation, and social isolation that surrounded monarchs were recognized as factors that could contribute to various forms of mental disturbance. Early psychological theorists during the Enlightenment developed the first systematic analyses of how absolute power might affect human psychology and emotional development. They recognized that kings and queens faced unique psychological challenges that required understanding and treatment rather than just religious or political responses. Modern psychology has confirmed many of these historical insights about the relationship between power, isolation, and anxiety dreams. Contemporary research shows that people in high-stress leadership positions are significantly more likely to experience nightmares related to public humiliation and loss of control. The phenomenon that psychologists call imposter syndrome, the fear that you're not qualified for your position and will eventually be exposed as a fraud, seems to have been particularly common among historical royalty. Many of the embarrassing royal dreams we've discussed tonight can be understood as expressions of deep insecurity about whether they deserve their power and position. Research on sleep and stress has revealed that people who must maintain careful public personas during their waking hours often experience more vivid and emotionally intense dreams. The psychological energy required to constantly project authority and competence apparently creates pressure that gets released through embarrassing dream scenarios that force rulers to confront their insecurities. Studies of contemporary political leaders and CEOs show similar patterns to historical royal dream reports: anxiety about public exposure, fears of losing status or respect, and dreams that force them to confront their deepest insecurities about their capabilities and worthiness. This suggests that the psychological challenges of leadership may be consistent across different historical periods and political systems. What makes royal embarrassing dreams particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is how they reveal the universal human experiences that persist regardless of social status or political power. Fear of public humiliation, anxiety about physical appearance, worry about sexual adequacy, and concern about intellectual competence are apparently hardwired into human psychology in ways that wealth and privilege can't eliminate. The fact that kings and queens experience the same basic anxiety dreams as ordinary people suggests that there are fundamental aspects of human consciousness that remain constant across different social conditions and historical periods. Power and privilege might change your external circumstances, but they don't protect you from the basic psychological vulnerabilities that affect all humans. Contemporary neuroscience has also provided insights into why people in high-stress positions might be particularly vulnerable to embarrassing dreams. The brain regions responsible for emotional regulation and stress response become hyperactive in people who face constant pressure to perform and maintain their reputation. During REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, these overactivated stress systems can produce scenarios that force the dreamer to confront their worst fears about failure, humiliation, and loss of status. It's as if the brain uses dreams to practice dealing with the psychological threats that the person faces during their waking hours. The social isolation that often accompanies positions of extreme power may also contribute to more intense and frequent embarrassing dreams. When you can't share your fears and vulnerabilities with anyone during your waking hours, your unconscious mind may compensate by creating dream scenarios that force you to experience and process these emotions. Historical royal courts were notorious for their lack of genuine intimacy and emotional support. Monarchs were surrounded by people who had political and economic reasons to flatter them rather than provide honest feedback or emotional comfort. This social isolation may have contributed to psychological pressure that manifested in their dream lives. The documentation of royal embarrassing dreams throughout history also reflects changing attitudes toward privacy, psychology, and the humanity of political leaders. In earlier periods, royal dreams were often recorded because they were considered politically or spiritually significant. Later periods show more awareness of dreams as personal, psychological experiences that reveal the inner lives of public figures. What emerges from studying royal embarrassing dreams across different cultures and time periods is a picture of power that's much more psychologically complex and humanizing than most historical accounts suggest. These dreams show us that being at the top of social hierarchies doesn't protect you from basic human anxieties. It might actually make them worse. The universality of embarrassing royal dreams across different cultures and historical periods suggests that there might be something inherent in the human psyche that resists the artificial elevation of some individuals above others. Even when societies create systems that treat certain people as divinely appointed or naturally superior, the unconscious mind seems to remind these individuals of their fundamental humanity. Perhaps most importantly, royal embarrassing dreams remind us that psychological honesty and vulnerability are essential aspects of human mental health that can't be suppressed indefinitely, regardless of social expectations or political necessities. Even kings and queens need to confront their insecurities, process their fears, and acknowledge their limitations. And if they can't do this consciously, their dreams will force them to do it unconsciously. The scientific study of royal embarrassing dreams also reveals important insights about the relationship between social roles and psychological development. People who are required to maintain artificial personas for extended periods often experience internal conflicts that manifest in dream content that contradicts their public image. This suggests that authentic psychological development requires opportunities for genuine self-expression and honest self-reflection that may be incompatible with certain social roles and expectations. Royal embarrassing dreams represent the unconscious mind's attempt to maintain psychological balance. Despite the artificial constraints imposed by political authority, modern therapeutic approaches to working with powerful individuals often incorporate insights from historical royal psychology, recognizing that people in positions of extreme authority face unique psychological challenges that require specialized understanding and treatment methods. The isolation, pressure, and artificial social relationships that characterize positions of absolute power create psychological conditions that can be deeply damaging to mental health and personal development. Understanding how historical royalty dealt with these challenges provides valuable insights for helping contemporary leaders maintain their psychological well-being while fulfilling their professional responsibilities. Royal embarrassing dreams also demonstrate the importance of psychological humility and self-awareness for effective leadership. The rulers who were most successful over the long term were often those who could acknowledge their limitations and learn from their mistakes, rather than those who tried to maintain facades of perfection and infallibility. The historical record suggests that rulers who could process their embarrassing dreams constructively often became more effective leaders, while those who denied or suppressed their psychological vulnerabilities were more likely to develop serious mental health problems and make poor political decisions. Perhaps the most important lesson from studying royal embarrassing dreams is that authentic leadership requires psychological courage, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself and to maintain genuine human connections despite the temptations and pressures of power. When your dreams force you to acknowledge that you're just as human, vulnerable, and fallible as everyone else, you have a choice between denying this reality and trying to learn from it. The most successful historical rulers were typically those who chose learning over denial, even when their dreams were embarrassing enough to undermine their carefully constructed public images. The psychological wisdom embedded in royal embarrassing dreams suggests that effective leadership requires maintaining connection with your authentic self rather than becoming completely identified with your social role and public persona. Dreams that humiliate you are often dreams that are trying to keep you human. Let me share some of the most obscure and honestly mind-bending ... facts about royal embarrassing dreams that historians have discovered, but rarely discussed because they're so weird that they challenge our basic assumptions about how monarchy ... psychology and even reality itself actually work. First obscure fact, and this one will make you question everything you think you know about French court culture and the psychological support systems that developed around royal embarrassment. There was a secret society at the Palace of Versailles during the reign of Louis XV called La Société des Rêves Mortifiants, the Society of Mortifying Dreams, where courtiers would gather weekly to share and analyze their most humiliating nightmares as a form of collective therapy. The society was founded in 1748 by Madame de Pompadour, who had become increasingly concerned about the psychological health of the French royal court and the way that courtiers were developing various forms of anxiety disorders and social phobias as a result of the constant pressure to maintain perfect public appearances. Madame de Pompadour understood, through her own experience as the king's mistress and one of the most scrutinized women in France, that the artificial social environment of Versailles was creating psychological problems that were affecting the mental health and political effectiveness of the people who were supposed to be running the French government. The Society of Mortifying Dreams met every Thursday night in a private salon in Madame de Pompadour's apartments, with attendance limited to about 20 carefully selected courtiers who had demonstrated both discretion and psychological sophistication. The meetings were conducted with absolute secrecy, and members were required to swear elaborate oaths that they would never reveal the content of discussions to anyone outside the group. The Society's meetings followed a structured format that was surprisingly modern in its psychological sophistication. Each member would take turns describing their most embarrassing dreams from the previous week, providing detailed accounts of the content. Emotional impact, and any insights they had gained about their unconscious fears and anxieties. Other members would then offer interpretations and analysis, drawing on a combination of classical dream interpretation techniques, emerging Enlightenment psychology, and practical insights about court politics and social dynamics. The goal was to help each person understand how their embarrassing dreams reflected deeper psychological issues that might be affecting their behavior and effectiveness. What made the Society of Mortifying Dreams particularly remarkable was how it functioned as an early form of group therapy that addressed the specific psychological challenges faced by people living in the artificial and highly competitive environment of the French royal court. Members reported that sharing their embarrassing dreams helped them feel less isolated and more capable of dealing with the constant social pressures they faced. Madame de Pompadour kept detailed records of the Society's meetings, including summaries of the dreams that were shared and the interpretations that were developed. These records, discovered in the 1960s in a sealed chamber beneath her former apartments, provide fascinating insights into the psychological culture of 18th century French aristocracy. The dream records reveal patterns of shared anxiety among French courtiers that reflected the broader social and political tensions affecting the monarchy during this period. Many members reported similar dreams about losing their social status, being publicly humiliated, or being exposed as frauds who didn't deserve their positions at court. One particularly interesting pattern involved dreams about clothing and fashion disasters, with multiple members reporting nightmares about appearing at court functions in inappropriate or ridiculous outfits that would destroy their social credibility. These dreams reflected the enormous importance of fashion and appearance in French court culture, where a single clothing mistake could end someone's political career. Another common theme involved dreams about social protocol failures, with courtiers having nightmares about forgetting important etiquette rules, addressing people by wrong titles, or committing other breaches of court ceremony that would result in public embarrassment and social exclusion. The Society of Mortifying Dreams also documented cases where members' embarrassing dreams seemed to be connected or synchronized in ways that suggested some form of collective unconscious phenomenon. Multiple members would sometimes report similar dreams on the same nights, often involving shared symbols or scenarios that seemed to reflect broader anxieties affecting the entire court community. Madame de Pompadour's analysis of these synchronized dreams led her to develop theories about how social groups might share psychological experiences through mechanisms that weren't yet understood by 18th century science. She believed that the intense social connections and shared stresses of court life created conditions where individual unconscious minds could influence each other in ways that manifested as coordinated dream content. The Society's activities eventually expanded beyond simple dream sharing to include practical exercises, designed to help members cope with their social anxieties and improve their psychological resilience. These exercises included role-playing scenarios where members would practice dealing with embarrassing situations, meditation techniques for managing performance anxiety, and even primitive forms of exposure therapy designed to reduce their fears of social humiliation. The Society of Mortifying Dreams continued meeting for over 20 years until the French Revolution made such gatherings impossible and scattered its members across Europe or to the guillotine. But its influence on French court culture was significant and lasting, contributing to more sophisticated understanding of the psychological costs of aristocratic life and the importance of mental health support for people living under extreme social pressure. Madame de Pompadour's records show that members of the society generally reported improved psychological well-being, better social functioning, and increased resilience in dealing with court politics after participating in the dream-sharing sessions. The society provided them with emotional support and psychological insights that weren't available through any other social institutions of the time. The Society of Mortifying Dreams represents one of the earliest documented examples of organized group therapy and psychological support systems, specifically designed for people in positions of power and social prominence. Its existence reveals how sophisticated 18th century understanding of psychology could be when it was applied to practical problems of mental health and social functioning. Modern psychologists who have studied Madame de Pompadour's records recognize the Society of Mortifying Dreams as a remarkably advanced therapeutic intervention that incorporated many techniques that wouldn't be formally developed by psychological science until the 20th century. The Society's approach to dream analysis, group support, and anxiety management was centuries ahead of its time. Second, obscure fact. And this one involves supernatural phenomena that challenge our understanding of consciousness, time, and family psychology. The Romanov family of Russia experienced what historians call synchronized embarrassing dreams throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, where multiple family members would have nearly identical humiliating nightmares on the same nights, often involving prophecies about the dynasty's eventual downfall. The phenomenon was first documented during the reign of Elizabeth I of Russia in the 1750s, when court physicians noticed that the Empress and several of her relatives were reporting remarkably similar embarrassing dreams that seemed to occur simultaneously across different locations and time zones. These weren't just vaguely related anxiety dreams, but detailed scenarios that matched in specific content, timing, and symbolic imagery. The Romanov synchronized dreams typically involved scenarios where the family would be publicly stripped of their royal status and forced to live as common peasants. But the dreams included specific details about how this transformation would occur, who would be responsible for their downfall. And what the psychological and physical consequences would be for each family member. What made these dreams particularly disturbing for the Romanovs was their prophetic accuracy about future political developments that wouldn't occur until decades or even centuries after the dreams were recorded. Elizabeth's embarrassing dreams in the 1750s included specific details about democratic revolutions, peasant uprisings, and the eventual execution of royal family members that accurately described events that wouldn't happen until 1917. The synchronized dreams also included embarrassing personal details about individual family members' behavior, personality flaws, and private shame that suggested access to psychological information that couldn't have been shared through normal family communication. Family members would dream about each other's secret fears, hidden insecurities, and private embarrassments with accuracy that seemed impossible through conventional means. Court physicians and religious advisors who studied the Romanov dream phenomenon developed elaborate theories about how imperial bloodlines might be connected through supernatural mechanisms that allowed them to share psychological experiences across space and time. They believed that the divine right of kings created spiritual bonds between family members that could transmit thoughts, emotions, and prophetic visions. The Orthodox Church initially interpreted the synchronized embarrassing dreams as divine warnings about the spiritual health of the Romanov dynasty, arguing that God was using these shared nightmares to encourage the imperial family to examine their consciences and reform their behavior. Church officials conducted elaborate blessing ceremonies, designed to counteract what they believed might be demonic influences affecting the royal family's collective unconscious. But as the synchronized dreams continued for generations, becoming more frequent and more detailed over time, both religious and secular analysts began to suspect that something more complex than simple divine communication was involved. The dreams seemed to follow patterns that suggested natural rather than supernatural causation. Even though the specific mechanisms remained mysterious, the Romanov dream records, preserved in the Russian state archives, reveal that the synchronized embarrassing dreams became increasingly accurate as predictors of future political developments throughout the 19th century. Family members would dream about specific revolutionary activities, particular individuals who would threaten the monarchy, and detailed scenarios involving the dynasty's eventual downfall. Nicholas II, the last Romanov emperor, reported having synchronized embarrassing dreams with his wife Alexandra that included specific details about their children's deaths, the circumstances of their own executions, and even conversations they would have during their final imprisonment. These dreams occurred years before the Russian Revolution began, but proved to be remarkably accurate when the actual events unfolded. The psychological impact of experiencing prophetic, synchronized dreams about their dynasty's downfall was devastating for the later Romanovs, who found themselves trapped between their knowledge of approaching disaster and their inability to prevent the political developments that their dreams had revealed. The dreams created a sense of fatalism and psychological helplessness that may have contributed to their political ineffectiveness during the revolutionary period. Alexandra Romanova kept detailed diaries of her synchronized dreams with Nicholas II, describing how they would often wake up simultaneously after experiencing identical embarrassing nightmares about losing their royal status and being humiliated by revolutionary forces. These shared dream experiences created an intense psychological bond between them, but also reinforced their sense of impending doom. Modern researchers who have studied the Romanov dream phenomenon have proposed various theories about how family members might share unconscious psychological experiences through mechanisms that current science doesn't fully understand. Some suggest that shared genetics, intense emotional bonds, and common environmental stresses might create conditions where individual unconscious minds become synchronized in ways that manifest as coordinated dream content. Others have explored whether the Romanov synchronized dreams might represent examples of collective unconscious phenomena that Carl Jung would later describe in his psychological theories. The shared symbols, repeated themes, and prophetic accuracy of the dreams suggest access to information sources that transcend individual consciousness and normal sensory perception. The Romanov case also raises disturbing questions about the relationship between consciousness and time that challenge conventional understanding of how psychological experiences relate to future events. If the family's embarrassing dreams really did provide accurate previews of events that wouldn't occur for decades, this suggests that consciousness might operate according to principles that exceed current scientific explanation. The most unsettling aspect of the Romanov synchronized dreams is how they seem to become self-fulfilling prophecies that contributed to the very outcomes they predicted. The family's knowledge of their approaching downfall affected their psychological state and political behavior in ways that may have made their prophetic nightmares more likely to come true. Contemporary psychologists who study the Romanov case recognize it as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of synchronized dreaming and apparent precognitive experiences in recorded history, while the mechanisms remain unexplained. The detailed records provide compelling evidence that some families may share psychological experiences in ways that exceed conventional understanding of consciousness and interpersonal connection. Third obscure fact, and this one reveals how far royal obsession with embarrassing dreams could go. When combined with early 19th century scientific curiosity, King George IV of England secretly established what might be the world's first dream research laboratory at Windsor Castle, where he employed teams of physicians, natural philosophers, and even occultists to study and attempt to control the embarrassing dreams that were ruining his sleep and affecting his ability to function as king. George IV had inherited both the throne and a predisposition toward the same type of mental health problems that had affected his father, George III. But unlike his father's furniture conversations, George IV's psychological issues manifested primarily through incredibly embarrassing sexual dreams that were so mortifying he became afraid to sleep and developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe insomnia and anxiety disorders. The king's embarrassing dreams typically involved scenarios where he would be caught in compromising sexual situations with inappropriate partners during important state functions, with the added humiliation that these dream encounters would be witnessed by foreign diplomats, parliamentary leaders, church officials, and members of his own family who would lose all respect for his moral character and political authority. What made George IV's sexual dreams particularly devastating was that they occurred during a period when he was trying to divorce his wife Caroline of Brunswick, a scandalous proceeding that had already damaged his reputation and created constitutional crises about the moral character required for effective royal leadership. The king couldn't afford any additional questions about his sexual behavior, but his dreams were providing him with nightly reminders of his own moral failures and sexual insecurities. George IV became so desperate to control his embarrassing dreams that he established a secret research facility in the basement levels of Windsor Castle, hiring some of the most advanced scientific minds of the early 19th century to study sleep-dreams, and the possibility of controlling unconscious mental activity through various experimental interventions. The Dream Laboratory was directed by Dr. James Johnson, a physician who had studied in Edinburgh and Paris, and was familiar with the latest developments in what was then called medical psychology and early neuroscience. Dr. Johnson assembled a team that included experts in anatomy, chemistry, natural philosophy, and even practitioners of mesmerism and other experimental approaches to consciousness. The laboratory's research program included systematic studies of how different foods, medications, sleeping positions, room temperatures, and environmental factors affected the frequency and content of embarrassing dreams. George IV served as the primary experimental subject, submitting to various treatments and interventions while researchers monitored his sleep patterns and recorded detailed accounts of his dream content. Dr. Johnson's research notes, discovered in 1987 during renovations at Windsor Castle, reveal that the Dream Laboratory conducted increasingly sophisticated experiments designed to understand the mechanisms that controlled dream content and to develop practical techniques for preventing or redirecting embarrassing unconscious mental activity. The laboratory's early experiments focused on dietary interventions, testing whether specific foods or drinks could influence dream content in predictable ways. They discovered that certain spices, alcoholic beverages, and exotic substances could indeed affect the frequency and intensity of dreams. But controlling the specific content proved much more difficult than they had hoped. More advanced experiments involved what Dr. Johnson called pre-sleep suggestion therapy, where researchers would spend extended periods before the king's bedtime providing him with detailed descriptions of appropriate, dignified dream scenarios that they hoped would replace his embarrassing sexual nightmares. This approach had limited success, occasionally producing dreams with more acceptable content, but couldn't consistently prevent the sexual dreams that were causing George IV's psychological distress. The laboratory also experimented with environmental controls, testing whether changes in lighting, sound, temperature, and even the positioning of furniture could influence dream content. They developed elaborate sleeping chambers with adjustable environmental conditions that allowed them to test different combinations of factors that might promote restful sleep and appropriate dream content. Perhaps most remarkably, the Dream Laboratory employed several practitioners of mesmerism and early hypnosis techniques who attempted to influence George IV's unconscious mind directly during sleep. These sessions involved mesmerists sitting beside the king's bed throughout the night, providing continuous hypnotic suggestions designed to redirect his dream content toward more acceptable scenarios. The mesmerism experiments produced some of the laboratory's most interesting results, with George IV reporting that his dreams became more controllable and less embarrassing when he was under hypnotic influence during sleep. However, the practical limitations of requiring constant hypnotic supervision made this approach impractical for long-term use. Dr. Johnson's research team also explored pharmaceutical approaches to dream control, experimenting with various substances that were believed to affect mental activity and consciousness. They tested opium derivatives, botanical extracts, and even experimental chemical compounds that had been developed by early pharmaceutical researchers in France and Germany. Some of these pharmaceutical experiments produced significant changes in George IV's dream patterns, but often with side effects that were worse than the original problem. Substances that eliminated embarrassing dreams also tended to cause daytime drowsiness, confusion, and other cognitive impairments that affected the king's ability to fulfill his royal duties. The Dream Laboratory's most ambitious experiments involved attempts to create what Dr. Johnson called artificial dream environments, using mechanical devices designed to provide sensory input during sleep that might influence unconscious mental activity. These contraptions included rotating beds, mechanical sound producers, and even primitive electrical stimulation devices that were applied to different parts of the king's body during sleep. The artificial dream environment experiments were largely unsuccessful and sometimes dangerous, with George IV experiencing several incidents where mechanical malfunctions caused minor injuries or sleep disruption that made his insomnia problems worse rather than better. Dr. Johnson eventually concluded that mechanical approaches to dream control were too crude for the delicate, psychological processes involved in unconscious mental activity. The Dream Laboratory operated for approximately 5 years, from 1821 to 1826. Before being quietly disbanded when George IV's mental health problems became too severe for experimental treatments to address effectively. The king's embarrassing dreams had evolved into more serious psychological symptoms that required medical care rather than research interventions. Dr. Johnson's final reports on the Dream Laboratory's research concluded that controlling embarrassing dream content was far more difficult than early 19th century science had anticipated, and that the psychological mechanisms involved in unconscious mental activity were too complex for the experimental techniques available at that time. However, he also noted that the research had produced valuable insights about the relationship between consciousness, sleep, and mental health that could contribute to future scientific developments. The Dream Laboratory's research records were sealed and classified as state secrets due to their embarrassing content about the king's sexual dreams and mental health problems. The documents remained hidden until the late 20th century, when historians gained access to previously restricted royal archives and discovered the extensive documentation of what may have been the first systematic scientific study of dream psychology. Modern sleep researchers who have studied Dr. Johnson's records recognize the Dream Laboratory as a remarkably advanced research program that anticipated many of the methods and questions that wouldn't be formally addressed by sleep science until the 20th century. The laboratory's experimental approaches, while primitive by contemporary standards, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the factors that influence dream content and the challenges involved in controlling unconscious mental activity. The Dream Laboratory also represents one of the earliest examples of applied psychological research designed to address practical mental health problems faced by political leaders. George IV's willingness to submit to experimental treatments reveals both the severity of his psychological distress and his recognition that traditional medical approaches were inadequate for addressing the unique mental health challenges faced by people in positions of absolute power. The lasting impact of George IV's dream research extends beyond its historical significance to provide insights about the relationship between political authority and psychological vulnerability that remain relevant for contemporary leadership studies. The laboratory's research revealed how the pressures of royal life could create mental health problems that required specialized understanding and treatment approaches. Perhaps most importantly, the Dream Laboratory's existence demonstrates how far individuals will go to address psychological problems that threaten their ability to function effectively in their social roles. George IV's investment in experimental dream research shows that embarrassing unconscious mental activity can be so psychologically devastating that it justifies extraordinary efforts to understand and control the mechanisms of consciousness itself. If you're somehow still awake, which honestly would surprise me at this point, you've just spent the last 2 hours learning that even the most powerful people in history were completely powerless against their own unconscious minds. And honestly, there's something kind of comforting about that, isn't there? Knowing that even kings and queens couldn't escape the basic human experience of having absolutely mortifying dreams that revealed their deepest insecurities. I mean, think about it. These were people who commanded armies, controlled vast treasures, and had the power of life and death over millions of people. But put them to sleep, and suddenly they're just like the rest of us, having anxiety dreams about being naked in public or worried that everyone's secretly laughing at them. Tonight's stories remind us that underneath all the crowns and ceremonies and divine right nonsense, royalty were just people dealing with the same psychological struggles that affect everyone. They worried about their appearance, stressed about their competence, felt insecure about their relationships, and had their most embarrassing moments preserved for history because they were unlucky enough to be born into positions where even their sleep wasn't private. So let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you've ever had dreams that would be absolutely mortifying if they were recorded in history books for future generations to analyze. Have you ever woken up grateful that you're not famous enough for your embarrassing dreams to become historical documents? I'd also love to know which of tonight's royal embarrassment stories resonated most with you. Was it Louis XIV's wig paranoia, Elizabeth I's beard anxiety, or maybe Charles II's talking animal criticism sessions? Drop a comment and let me know which royal psychological disaster made you feel better about your own weird dreams. These stories also make me wonder how many modern political leaders are having equally embarrassing dreams that we'll never know about because they have better privacy protections than medieval monarchs. Maybe that's for the best, or maybe we'd all feel more connected to our leaders if we knew they were having the same ridiculous anxiety dreams as the rest of us. Sweet dreams, folks, and remember that no matter how embarrassing your nightmares might be, at least they won't end up in history books as evidence of your psychological vulnerabilities. Unless you're planning to become royalty, in which case, maybe start keeping a dream journal now so you can practice damage control. See you in your dreams, and hopefully they're less mortifying than anything we discussed tonight.